my YouTube family. Welcome back to Crime Whisper, the place where dark stories meet quiet nights. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments below. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to join this growing community of midnight truth seekers now. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you wish, because it's time to whisper some Crime Story 1. The murder of Samantha Dean. It was June 6, 2000. A quiet, residential neighborhood in Fort Worth, Texas, was about to become the scene of a horrifying crime, one that would shock the community and make headlines across the country. The victim, 9-year-old Samantha Dean, devoted mother of two, her body was found inside her own home, the one place she should have felt safest. But that night, her sanctuary became her tomb. Samantha was well known in her neighborhood. She was friendly, outgoing, and always greeted others with a warm smile, working as a secretary at a local law firm. She had a reputation for being kind-hearted and generous. Neighbors described her as a woman who was always willing to lend a hand or offer kind words. No one could imagine her having enemies, let alone being the target of something so brutal. Events that led to Samantha's tragic end began just after dinner that evening. Her ex-husband, 42-year-old Gregory Johnson, had come by to pick up their children for his scheduled visitation. The two had been divorced for several years, but had managed to maintain an amicable relationship for the sake of their kids. Everything seemed normal at first. Gregory was a regular, involved father, and Samantha always prioritized civility in their interactions, even though the divorce had been emotionally difficult. Both had committed to co-parenting peacefully, but something was different that night. Shortly after Gregory arrived, the two were seen having a conversation in the kitchen. Neighbors would later report hearing raised voices, though no one thought it was serious enough to warrant concern, just a typical ex-couple exchange. They assumed hours passed. Around 11 p.m., a neighbor, walking her dog, noticed that the lights inside Samantha's house were still a rare occurrence. What troubled her more was the unusual silence. The house, normally lively with the sound of Samantha and her children, was now eerily quiet. That unease prompted her to call the police. By the time officers arrived shortly after midnight, Samantha was already gone. The front door was slightly ajar. There were no signs of forced entry. The home was disturbingly still, but the kitchen told a story. No one was prepared. For blood smeared across the floor. A brutal scene frozen in time. Samantha lay face up in the center of the room. A knife still lodged in her chest. It was a calculated and deeply personal attack. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a break-in or robbery. Everything pointed to the killer being someone Samantha had known, someone she had likely trusted enough to let in. Investigators quickly began combing through her recent contacts, starting with the last person who had seen her alive, her ex-husband, Gregory Johnson. From the beginning, Gregory stood out. The timing, the location, the lack of forced entry, it all aligned. While Gregory and Samantha had kept things civil on the surface, friends told police there had been rising tensions between them in the weeks leading up to the murder, especially over custody arrangements. Some of Samantha's close friends would later come forward with chilling details. She had recently expressed feeling uneasy around Gregory. She couldn't explain why, but something about his energy had shifted, something that made her feel unsafe. And on that fateful evening, those quiet fears turned into unspeakable tragedy. Despite the growing suspicion surrounding Gregory Johnson, police found themselves in a difficult position. Something about his interactions with Samantha had seemed off-strained, uneasy, but there wasn't enough solid evidence to make an arrest. So, the investigation pressed on. Gregory, for his part, was cooperative. He maintained that he had nothing to do with Samantha's death. According to him, he had simply picked up the kids, exchanged a few words with Samantha, and left peacefully. When forensic teams scoured the crime scene, they found no trace of his DNA. His fingerprints appeared only on a kitchen glass, likely from earlier in the evening. Nothing that could directly tie him to the murder. Without physical evidence or a clear motive, the case stalled Investigators grew increasingly frustrated then. 3 days after the murder, the case took an unexpected and dramatic turn. A neighbor stepped forward with new information. She recalled seeing a man she didn't recognize leaving Samantha's home around 10:30 p.m. On the night of the murder, he walked briskly down the street toward a parked black sedan before driving off. At the time, she didn't think much of it, perhaps just a friend visiting, but after hearing the news of Samantha's death, she realized what she had witnessed might be vital to the investigation. This new lead reignited the case. Police quickly began tracing the identity of the mystery man. It didn't take long to uncover his name, Wright, 38 years old, with a long rap sheet that included assault, drug possession, and theft days. It turned out David wasn't a stranger to Samantha. He had been introduced to her months earlier by none other than Gregory Johnson. While the nature of Gregory and David's relationship remained unclear, what was obvious was that the two shared a history behind the scenes. Gregory had been dabbling in criminal activities, something he had kept carefully hidden from Samantha. David Wright, it seemed, wasn't just a friend, he was an accomplice. Deeper police dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Investigators turned their full attention to David Wright, suspecting he held the key to the case. A search of David's apartment would prove to be the tipping point. Inside, officers found a shirt stained with blood. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Samantha Denon. June 9th, 2000. David Wright was arrested and formally charged with Samantha's murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. People were stunned not just by David's involvement, but by the dark connection he shared with Gregory. But there were still unanswered questions. Had David acted alone? Or was Gregory more involved than he was letting on? During initial interrogations, David remained mostly silent. He denied killing Samantha. He claimed that he had only stopped by her house earlier in the evening to meet up with Gregory, that he hadn't stayed long, and certainly hadn't harmed anyone. But his story didn't add up. He was seen leaving the house much later that night, and the bloody shirt, it completely contradicted his timeline. Investigators began to suspect that David was covering for someone, or perhaps not telling the whole truth to protect himself. As they peeled back the layers of his past, they found a pattern of violence, assaults, robberies, prison stints. David was no stranger to chaos, but the question remained, why Samantha? What was the motive? The answer, as it turned out, lay in the twisted relationship between David and Gregory. The two men had met years earlier while serving time in a Texas prison. After their release, they reconnected and their friendship quickly deepened. But it wasn't built on loyalty or brotherhood. It was rooted in mutual desperation. Gregory had been spiraling financially and morally. He was falling back into crime, and David was right there with him. Together, they had been involved in low-level drug trafficking and petty theft operations Samantha knew nothing about, but she had begun to sense it. In the months leading up to her death, Samantha confided in close friends that she was growing increasingly worried about Gregory's behavior. He was becoming volatile, erratic, nothing like the man she had once known. She feared he was slipping back into the criminal underworld and dragging dangerous people into their children's lives. Her intuition was tragically accurate. David's presence in Gregory's life hadn't just been toxic, it had been deadly. Investigators discovered that Samantha had recently tried to limit Gregory's access to the children. She'd even considered revisiting the custody agreement. Fearing for their safety, that decision may have been what pushed everything over the edge. Gregory had been desperate. His financial troubles were mounting, and his ex-wife, though one person who had any control over him, was threatening to disrupt the only stability he had left. His role as a father, it appeared David Wright wasn't just some rogue outsider. He may have been the instrument, but the motive that might have belonged to Gregory. And the question now became, was this murder premeditated, or was David acting on someone else's orders? As detectives dug deeper into the case, a clearer, more disturbing picture began to emerge. Gregory Johnson, Samantha's ex-husband, had developed a reputation for being volatile, even ruthless. Beneath his seemingly cooperative exterior, investigators learned that on the night of Samantha's murder, Gregory had planned to confront her over a tense dispute regarding the custody of their 2 children, according to evidence and witness statements. Samantha had recently informed Gregory of her intent to legally modify their custody arrangement, a move that deeply unsettled him. He had been struggling emotionally and financially, and this change threatened what little control he felt he still had. The argument that evening escalated quickly. Gregory, growing increasingly agitated, made a call to David Wright. What happened next remains shrouded in some uncertainty, but it is believed that David soon arrived at the house and became directly involved in the confrontation. While the exact sequence of events is unclear, one fact is chillingly certain. David Wright was the one who stabbed Samantha to death, and it was no random act. The knife used in the murder came from David's personal collection. Forensic reports showed that Samantha had sustained multiple defensive wounds on her arms and hands. She fought for her life, but ultimately, she was overpowered. Investigators began collecting witness testimonies. Several people who had seen Gregory and David in the days leading up to the murder recalled their strange behavior. Gregory had been tense, angry. David, on the other hand, seemed strangely eager, as if he were preparing to handle something for his friend. Some witnesses even remembered overhearing Gregory say things like, "I need to take care of this," though they didn't understand the gravity of his words at the time. Then came a pivotal breakthrough. A neighbor of Gregory's came forward with a disturbing account on the evening of June 6th. She had seen Gregory and David arguing in the driveway. She clearly heard Gregory yell, "I told you she wouldn't listen. You need to make her listen." That moment, combined with the forensic evidence, brought everything into focus. Bloody shirt found in David's apartment, soaked with Samantha's blood, was the final piece of the puzzle. On June 12, 2000, David Wright was formally charged with capital murder. Gregory Johnson, who had already been under investigation, was also charged as an accomplice to capital murder. Authorities now believed that while Gregory may not have physically killed Samantha, he had orchestrated the attack, knowing David would be willing to carry it out. The community of Fort Worth was stunned. How could a man once trusted as a father and friend have allowed something so monstrous to happen? The horror of Samantha's death was only magnified by the betrayal that her life had been taken by the very people who were supposed to care for her and her children. As the case unfolded, Samantha's loved ones were left reeling. A memorial service was held in her honor, drawing dozens of mourners who remembered her for her kindness, her warm spirit, and her unwavering love for her children. But her absence left a void that could never be filled. Her children, now motherless, were left in the care of relatives, their lives forever changed by the actions of their father and his violent companion. The trial, seeking justice nearly 7 months later, in early 2001, the murder trial of David Wright and Gregory Johnson began. The courtroom was packed. Friends, family, former neighbors, all gathered, weighed down by a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief as the prosecution laid out the details of the crime. The full horror was revealed. Every testimony, every piece of evidence brought Samantha's final moments back to life. David's defense team tried to argue that he hadn't intended to kill Samantha, that the attack had happened in the heat of the moment. They claimed David had been manipulated by Gregory, who had orchestrated the encounter, and that David was merely a pawn in a much bigger plan. They painted him as a victim of influence, a man who had been pressured into a terrible decision by a trusted friend. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They presented overwhelming evidence: the bloody shirt, the weapon traced to David, and his presence at the scene. Forensic experts testified that the murder had been deliberate, premeditated. David wasn't a bystander, he was the executioner. Gregory's defense focused on distancing him from the physical act. His lawyers admitted that he had been present, that he was angry, that he had made poor choices, but they insisted he hadn't intended for Samantha to die, that he was just overwhelmed by his failing life, his finances, and a custody battle spiraling out of control. But again, the evidence told another story. Witnesses testified to Gregory's erratic behavior in the days before the murder. Neighbors had seen him agitated, muttering about how Samantha wasn't listening. Forensic evidence placed him in the home that night. His fingerprints were found on multiple objects. His DNA was on it. It became increasingly clear to the jury that while David had physically committed the murder, Gregory had set it all in motion. The trial dragged on for weeks. Each side fought to convince the jury, but in the end, the truth could not be buried. The people of Fort Worth, once familiar with Gregory and David's names for entirely different reasons, now knew them as the two men responsible for one of the most tragic, senseless murders the city had ever seen. And after days of testimony, evidence, and painful memories, the verdict was about to be delivered. Destio RY1, the verdict in Samantha Dean's case. After weeks of emotional testimony and mounting evidence, the jury finally reached a decision. David Wright was found guilty of capital murder. The jury determined that his actions had been cold, calculated, and shockingly brutal. The sheer ferocity of the attack on Samantha Dean, combined with forensic evidence and his refusal to show remorse, left no room for doubt. They recommended the death penalty. Gregory Johnson, Samantha's ex-husband, and the man believed to have orchestrated the crime, was also convicted of capital murder. However, his sentence differed. While the jury acknowledged his deep involvement in planning the attack, they stopped short of recommending death. Instead, Gregory was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They saw a man driven by desperation, not pure malice, but in the eyes of the law, his guilt remained. Clearing the days that followed the verdict, Fort Worth struggled to make sense of the tragedy for Samantha's family. The verdicts offered a sliver of closure, but no true comfort. Her children, left motherless, were placed in the care of relatives. The emotional wounds cut deep and healing would be long and uncertain. The courtroom had done its part. Justice had been served, but the loss of Samantha Dean, a loving mother, friend, and vibrant presence, left scars that time could not erase. Gregory Johnson would spend the rest of his life behind bars. David Wright would face the ultimate penalty. To men once bound by friendship and criminal secrets, now united in infamy. Though Fort Worth would never forget the horror of that June night, Samantha's memory lived uncarried in the hearts of those who loved her. Her spirit remained a quiet whisper in the community, a reminder of resilience, justice, and the tragic cost of unchecked darkness. Story 2. The murder of Angela Carter, Rockport, Texas. June 23, 2000. Rockport, Texas. A small, tight-knit town was about to be shaken by a crime so violent, so unexpected, that it would leave lasting scars on everyone who called it home. The victim, Angela Carter, a 47-year-old high school English teacher, well-loved, respected, and admired by her community. Angela had spent nearly a decade living in Rockport. She was a beacon in her school, known for her passion for literature, her engaging teaching style, and her ability to connect with students outside the classroom. She was just as generous, active in local charities, and a devoted animal lover to those who knew her. Angela seemed to have it all, but beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Her 20-year marriage to Charles Carter, a reserved local businessman, was unraveling. Friends and family described their relationship as strained and emotionally distant. Though Angela rarely spoke openly about their issues, those close to her knew she had been feeling isolated and unhappy, yet hesitant to leave. There were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of Charles being unfaithful, and though Angela never confronted them publicly, her quiet demeanor had changed in recent months. She seemed tired, burdened. On the evening of June 23rd, everything appeared normal. Angela's car was parked in the driveway. The lights inside her home glowed warmly. A neighbor, noticing that Angela hadn't answered a phone call around 10 p.m., something very unlike her, decided to check in. She walked over to Angela's home and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. Then she noticed the door was slightly ajar. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. The house was still silent. A metallic smell filled the air, and in the living room, Angela Carter's body lay in a pool of blood. A knife lay nearby, crimson-stained. The scene was one of chaos, of rage. She had been attacked with unrelenting violence. Police arrived around 10:30 p.m. and quickly confirmed what the neighbor already feared. Angela had been brutally murdered there. It was no forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. This wasn't a robbery. It was personal, and suspicion quickly turned to the man closest to her, Charles Carter. At first, Charles cooperated with investigators. He'd claimed he had been at home working late handling business paperwork. He said he hadn't seen Angela that evening, according to him. She had gone out earlier in the day, and they hadn't spoken since. But police weren't convinced. Charles' alibi quickly began to unravel. His shop, located just blocks away, had not been open late. No one had seen him. Their neighbors reported not seeing Charles at home either. His timeline didn't add up, and as the investigation continued, Rockport would soon discover that behind the quiet, reserved image of Charles Carter lay a man hiding secrets that might just have turned deadly. Charles Carter, a husband's darkness, unveiled. Charles Carter's lack of a solid alibi, paired with the violent nature of Angela's death, quickly positioned him as a prime suspect. Investigators began to uncover troubling details about the couple's marriage, accounts of heated arguments in the days leading up to her murder, and friends who spoke of Angela's growing emotional distress. She had confided in close friends that her relationship was falling apart, and one of them revealed that Angela had recently learned of Charles's infidelity. It was a discovery that may have marked the beginning of the end for their marriage, but it wasn't just marital tension that raised red flags. During a search of Charles's vehicle, investigators found blood on the passenger seat, later confirmed through forensic testing to match Angela's blood type. It was a damning piece of physical evidence that placed her in his car after the time she was last seen alive. And yet, the most incriminating revelation came from within the Carter household, from their son, Lucas. Initially devastated by his mother's death, Lucas insisted that his father couldn't have been involved, but under the weight of questioning, he eventually told investigators about a disturbing incident on the night of June 23rd while studying in his bedroom. Lucas overheard a violent argument between his parents. He couldn't catch every word, but one sentence stood out clearly. His father had shouted, "If you leave me, I'll make you regret it." At the time, Lucas dismissed it as another bitter exchange, but in the light of what followed, he realized something far more sinister may have occurred later that evening. Lucas saw his father leaving the house abruptly when he tried to speak to him. Charles coldly told him to stay in his room and not get involved with Lucas's testimony, the blood evidence, and Charles's inconsistent statements. The case finally came together on June 25, 2000, just 2 days after Angela's murder. Charles Carter was arrested and charged with her killing. His arrest sent shockwaves through Rockport, a town unaccustomed to such brutality. Many who had once admired Charles and Angela as a couple were stunned. The man they had known as a quiet, hard-working business owner now stood accused of a heinous crime. At the time of his arrest, Charles appeared eerily calm. His demeanor was cold, detached, even emotionless. He made no attempt to resist the officers during questioning. He denied any involvement in Angela's murder. He claimed their marriage, while strained, had never turned violent, and he insisted he had no motive to hurt her. He clung to his alibi. He had been at his auto repair shop that evening, working alone. But police were unconvinced. The evidence painted a different picture. Angela's blood in his car, the emotional turmoil in their relationship, the threat overheard by their son, and a timeline that didn't add up as investigators dug deeper into Charles's past. A more disturbing side of his character came to light. While he had always appeared reserved and soft-spoken, people from his earlier years recalled moments of volatility, instances of sudden rage, lashing out, and emotional outbursts. What had long appeared to be stoicism now looked more like suppression of anger, resentment, and control. Angela's friends confirmed what detectives were beginning to suspect. In the months before her death, she had been pulling away from her husband. She felt trapped in a loveless, hollow marriage. The final blow came when she confirmed the rumors of Charles's long-term affair. But what hurt her most wasn't the betrayal, it was his indifference. He never apologized, he never tried to make amends, he simply carried on, as if her pain meant nothing behind closed doors. Angela had started to prepare for divorce. She wanted out, for herself and for Lucas, but before she could make her exit, something snapped. Police learned that Charles had been involved with another woman, for nearly a year, a younger woman, whose identity was never publicly disclosed. She had become a regular fixture in his life, and investigators believed that Charles may have felt his double life was at risk of crumbling if Angela left him in his mind. The fear of losing control over his family, reputation, and financial standing could have triggered a fatal confrontation. Death wasn't just the result of a crumbling marriage, it was the product of control, betrayal, and suppressed rage finally boiling over. The town of Rockport would never be the same. Angela Carter, a beloved teacher and mother, was taken from her community in a moment of devastating violence, and the man once seen as her partner in life would now be known as the man who ended it. Charles's affair had become more than just a lapse in judgment, had grown into a dangerous obsession to him. The woman he was seeing represented freedom, an escape from the confines of a crumbling marriage. But when Angela discovered the truth, it devastated her. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was realizing that Charles no longer seemed to care about their family at all. Police uncovered a series of bitter arguments between the couple in the days leading up to Angela's murder. Neighbors reported hearing intense shouting late at night. Charles accused Angela of being controlling and unsympathetic, while Angela had grown more vocal about wanting out, a fresh start away from a loveless, suffocating marriage. That tension came to a head on the night of June 23, according to their son Lucas, who was home studying for finals. The argument between his parents escalated in a way he'd never heard before, though he couldn't make out every word. One line cut through the noise and lodged in his memory. "If you leave me, you'll regret it." At the time, Lucas thought it was another heated exchange, nothing new, but in hindsight, he realized it was something far darker. Angela had finally told Charles she wanted a divorce that evening. It was a long time coming. That revelation was the spark that ignited the explosion. Unable to cope with the idea of losing her and the life he thought he controlled, Charles flew into a rage. The argument turned physical, fueled by months of resentment. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed her over and over again. The attack was not just violent, it was frenzied. Investigators would later say that the number and nature of the wounds showed this wasn't a spur-of-a-moment outburst, was the unleashing of years of pent-up anger after killing Angela. Charles tried to cover his tracks. He cleaned up what he could, wiped the knife, and disposed of what little evidence he could manage in a panic, but he made critical mistakes. Bloodstains were found in his car. His hands bore marks consistent with a struggle, and he overlooked the one witness who had heard everything. His son Charles claimed he had been at his auto repair shop that night, but his alibi quickly unraveled. The timeline didn't match the forensic evidence, contradicted his story, and the most suspicious detail. Just before and after the murder, Charles had been making brief calls to the woman he was having an affair with. Investigators believed he was trying to build an alibi, or perhaps seeking comfort after the crime. As the evidence piled up, Charles Carter was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial began in early 2001 and quickly drew attention, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the shock it brought to the town of Rockport, to the outside world. Charles had always been quiet, composed, an upstanding citizen. No one could have imagined that behind closed doors, his life was unraveling so violently. The prosecution painted a damning picture. A man consumed by jealousy, desperate to maintain control, someone who viewed his wife not as a partner, but as a possession. They argued that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of rage, triggered by the fear of abandonment. The defense, meanwhile, claimed Charles was overwhelmed by stress. They argued temporary insanity, that he'd snapped in the heat of the moment and never intended to kill. But the jury didn't believe it. Charles Carter was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought some measure of justice, but the emotional fallout was just beginning. For Angela's loved ones. Her murder left a permanent scar. She had been more than just a devoted mother and dedicated teacher. She was a guiding force in many lives. Her absence created a void that couldn't be Her son faced the unthinkable. His mother was gone, and his father, the man he'd trusted, was the one responsible. The words he heard that night, "If you leave me, you'll regret it," played on a loop in his mind. He'd lost his mother, his father, and the life he once knew. Eventually, Lucas moved in with relatives in a neighboring town, trying to rebuild away from the trauma, but the shadow of that night followed him back in prison. Charles Carter began serving his sentence in silence. He showed no remorse at trial, but those who knew him said the weight of what he'd done settled in as the years passed. His punishment wasn't just life behind bars. It was the knowledge that he had destroyed the very family he claimed to love. The murder of Angela Carter sent shockwaves through Rockport. The man, once seen as a mild-mannered mechanic, had been hiding something far more sinister beneath the surface. In the aftermath, the town was left grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous monsters don't look like monsters at all. Charles Carter was a man once considered ordinary, but during his years in prison, the darker parts of him became undeniable. He had proven himself capable of extraordinary violence from behind bars. Charles occasionally sent letters to his remaining family members, trying to express remorse. He wrote to his son, Lucas, begging for forgiveness, but Lucas never responded. The damage Charles had inflicted was far too great, too deep. No letter, no apology, no word of regret could ever undo the horror of what he had done, or bring Angela back. The emotional scar left by her brutal and senseless murder was permanent. For those who had loved Angela Carter, there would be no closure, only grief, a silent, lingering grief that time could not erase. And yet, in the years following the trial, Angela's memory never faded. Her legacy lived on in the hearts of her students, her friends, and her community. She had been a compassionate teacher, a devoted mother, and a gentle soul who gave selflessly to others. Her former students shared stories about how she had inspired them. Her friends, still mourning, honored her with quiet acts of kindness in her name. In tribute to Angela, several scholarships were created to support students pursuing careers in education. One final gift from a woman who had spent her life nurturing others. Rockport, once a quiet town where life moved gently and predictably, would never be the same after June 23, 2000. The Carter home, once filled with laughter and love, became a silent landmark of loss. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the weight of what had happened. Others remained, but with heavy hearts haunted by memories of that night. Meanwhile, Charles Carter remained behind bars. His life was life without parole, but the real punishment wasn't just the walls around him. It was the endless solitude, the deafening silence, and the crushing awareness that he had destroyed everything he once had. His wife was gone, his son would never speak to him again, and the life he might have redeemed was shattered the moment he chose violence over love. In the quiet darkness of his cell, Charles came to understand the full weight of what he had done. His torment was internal, and it would last a lifetime. Lucas, too, bore a heavy burden, but unlike his father, he chose a different path. Though he never reconciled with Charles, he worked hard to rebuild his life. He moved forward, slowly and painfully. He graduated college, became a teacher, and dedicated his life to helping young people, the same way his mother once had. The pain of losing Angela would never fully leave him, but in carrying forward her legacy, Lucas found purpose. Her spirit, her values, her compassion, he kept them alive in every classroom he entered. As the years passed, the town of Rockport began to heal. Angela's murder remained a dark chapter, an unhealed scar in its history. But through it came new strength, the scholarships in her name, the community programs she once supported, the many lives she had touched. But Charles Carter, he would be remembered differently, as the man who lost everything, the man who let jealousy consume him, the man who turned on the very people who had loved him. His name became a warning, a grim reminder of how quickly love can turn into rage when left unchecked. His story was a cautionary tale, a stark lesson in the fragility of human relationships and the devastating cost of losing. Control Story 3: The Disappearance of Kathleen Katie Wilson in June 2000. The peaceful suburban town of Maplewood, Illinois was rocked by a crime that would leave lasting scars, a place known for its quiet streets and tight-knit community suddenly found itself at the center of one of the most unsettling investigations local authorities had ever faced. It began with the disappearance and eventual murder of 38-year-old Kathleen Katie Wilson. Katie was well known in Maplewood. Her warm smile, compassionate nature, and work as a nurse at the local hospital had earned her a place in the hearts of many. She was also a devoted mother to 2 young children, ages 8 and 6, and had been married to her high school sweetheart, 40-year-old Mark Wilson, for nearly 10 years. To outsiders, the Wilson family appeared picture perfect: a lovely home in a quiet cul-de-sac, friendly neighbors, and an enviable lifestyle. But inside their marriage, things were falling apart. Katie had confided in friends and co-workers that her relationship with Mark had grown distant, and tense arguments over money were frequent. She spoke of Mark becoming increasingly cold, even controlling some of her closest friends suspected infidelity. Though Katie never confirmed it, she was private about her personal life, but those who knew her could see she was deeply unhappy. The evening of June 18, 2000, Katie returned home from her hospital shift just after 10 p.m. Her children were already in bed. Mark wasn't home. He often worked late as a sales manager at a local car dealership. Katie settled into her nightly routine: a light snack, some TV, and a bit of time to herself. It was a night like any other, but Katie Wilson was never seen alive. Again around midnight, a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived next door for years, noticed something odd. She had just come back from a late walk when she saw the lights in the Wilson home still glowing. That wasn't unusual, but then she spotted the front door. It was ajar, just slightly. Katie was known to be cautious. She always locked her doors. Something felt off. Mrs. Thompson knocked, but there was no answer. Concerned, she walked around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Katie's purse sat on the kitchen table. Her shoes were still by the front door. The TV played softly in the background, but there was no sign of Katie. Mrs. Thompson immediately called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. The house was eerily still. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was broken. Nothing was out of place. Katie's car remained in the driveway. Her phone, her wallet, everything was untouched. It was as if she had simply vanished. The police quickly turned their attention to the most obvious person of interest: her husband, Mark. But when they contacted him, Mark claimed he was out of town, attending a sales meeting in a nearby city. Still, his story raised questions, and as detectives began to peel back the layers of the Wilsons' marriage, they discovered secrets and tensions that would eventually lead to a shocking truth. Story 3: The Murder of Katie Wilson in June 2000. A harrowing crime shook the quiet, family-friendly suburb of Maplewood, Illinois, known for its peaceful streets and close-knit community. The town was unprepared for the shock that would follow. The disappearance and eventual murder of 38-year-old Kathleen Katie Wilson. Katie was a beloved nurse at the local hospital and a devoted mother to her 2 young children, aged 8 and 6, married to her high school sweetheart, 40-year-old Mark Wilson, for nearly a decade. The couple seemed to embody the ideal suburban life. They owned a modest home, had strong ties with their neighbors, and appeared to be living the American dream. But, as investigators would soon learn, their seemingly perfect life masked deep cracks beneath the surface. Kate had recently confided in close friends and co-workers that her marriage was far from happy. She spoke of growing emotional distance, constant arguments over money, and an unsettling sense of control Mark exerted over her life. Some friends suspected Mark might have been unfaithful, though Katie never confirmed this. Still, she often expressed feeling trapped, watched, and emotionally drained. On the evening of June 18, 2000, Katie returned home after her shift at the hospital around 10 p.m. Her children were already asleep, and Mark, according to his routine, was reportedly away on a business trip alone. In the house, Katie followed her usual routine, grabbing a snack and settling in front of the television, but she would never be seen alive again around midnight. A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, noticed something odd returning from a late walk. She saw that the lights in the Wilson home were still on, and the front door was slightly ajar, knowing Katie was always meticulous about locking up. She grew uneasy. She knocked, but no one answered. Circling to the back, she peered through the kitchen window, and what she saw chilled her. Katie's purse sat on the table. Her shoes were by the door, and the faint glow of the TV flickered through the room, but Katie was nowhere in sight. Mrs. Thompson immediately called the police officers, arrived quickly, and searched the home. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Katie's car remained in the driveway, her belongings untouched. It appeared as if she had vanished without a trace. The investigation began with the most logical suspect. Her husband, Mark Wilson, claimed to be out of town for a sales meeting and had checked into a hotel at 9 o'clock p.m. His alibi appeared solid at first. He seemed genuinely distraught when informed of his wife's disappearance and quickly returned to Maplewood to assist in the search. But police were not convinced as the days passed and no trace of Katie was found. Suspicions around Mark deepened. A co-worker of Katie's, Sarah, told detectives that Katie had recently become worried about Mark's increasingly erratic behavior. He had started monitoring her calls, tracking her whereabouts, and showing signs of paranoia. Katie had even considered filing for divorce, but hadn't yet made a final decision. Digging deeper, investigators found that Mark had withdrawn large sums of money from the couple's joint account in the weeks leading up to Katie's disappearance. When questioned, Mark claimed it was for a business investment, but the explanation didn't add up. His behavior also raised red flags. He was detached from search efforts, minimally involved with investigators, and appeared to be waiting out the storm rather than actively trying to find his wife. Then, on June 24th, 6 days after Katie vanished, police received a tip from a local teenager who claimed he had seen a car matching Katie's parked near a secluded wooded area on the outskirts of town. Officers rushed to the scene and began a thorough search. Within hours, beneath a pile of leaves and brush, they found Katie's lifeless body. She had been strangled. Using a piece of her own clothing, the scene indicated she had been dragged into the woods, and the location eerily was near a route Mark often traveled for work. The brutal and intimate nature of her death left little doubt in investigators' minds. This was not a random act. This was personal, with her body discovered. The missing persons case officially became a homicide, and all attention turned back to Mark Wilson. Police brought Mark in for questioning again, while he appeared shaken. His responses were vague and emotionally flat as detectives pressed harder. Inconsistencies began to surface. His hotel check-in time was later than he initially claimed, and there was a suspicious gap in his timeline. The night Katie disappeared, a gas station clerk came forward, recalling seeing a car that matched Mark's near Maplewood that same evening, despite Mark's repeated insistence that he hadn't been in town. Though Mark continued to deny involvement, circumstantial evidence continued to mount. Katie's friends told investigators about Mark's controlling behavior, how he would unexpectedly show up at her workplace, check her messages, and follow her around town. One co-worker even overheard Katie say she feared Mark's temper and was unsure how he'd react if she asked for a divorce. Financial records showed Mark had withdrawn significant amounts of money in the days before Katie vanished without telling her. He claimed it was for business, but there were no documented investments or transactions to support his claim. Finally, the autopsy revealed what detectives had feared. Katie had been strangled, a highly personal and violent method of killing. The use of her own clothing to commit the murder added an even darker layer to the crime. It suggested rage, possession, and cruelty, traits that aligned with what many now believed Mark was capable of. The murder of Katie Wilson. The murder weapon wasn't a knife or a gun, it was something far more personal. Katie Wilson had been strangled with her own blouse, The brutality of the act spoke volumes. Whoever had killed her had been close physically and emotionally. The force used to tie the fabric around her neck had left deep compression marks, pointing not only to intent, but to rage. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was intimate, it was deliberate. Forensic specialists soon uncovered more beneath Katie. As fingernails were traces of her husband Mark's, DNA strong, evidence of a struggle. Katie had fought back. She had fought for her life, but she had been overpowered. Her body, hidden under a covering of leaves and branches in a wooded area outside Maplewood, was left as if someone had hoped nature would erase the crime, but it didn't. As detectives pieced together the puzzle, the image of Mark Wilson began to shift from grieving husband to likely killer. A man, once described as controlled and successful, was now revealing another side, a darker side. The discovery of Mark's DNA, the choice of weapon, and the dumping of Katie's body all painted a picture of someone who believed he could control the narrative, but he was wrong. Among the most damning evidence was a set of phone records. Mark had been in regular contact with a woman named Lisa Crawford, a colleague he had grown increasingly close to in the days before Katie's murder. Mark had called Lisa multiple times a day. One call, made just hours before Katie was last seen alive, lasted over 20 minutes. During that call, Mark sounded calm. Lisa later revealed to police that Mark had spoken often about his deteriorating marriage. He had told her he felt trapped and wanted out. While Lisa denied any knowledge of the murder, the timing and nature of their conversations raised serious concerns as the evidence mounted. Mark's cooperation with police began to wane. Once eager to help, he grew distant, avoided follow-up interviews, and became increasingly defensive. Investigators, now confident they had their suspect, arrested Mark Wilson on June 27, 2009, days after Katie's body was found. The town of Maplewood was stunned. Mark Wilson, the man who'd once seemed like a devoted husband, was now charged with murdering his wife. The shock rippled through the community. Neighbors, who once saw Mark as a family man, now questioned how well they really knew him. Katie's murder wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. Mark was charged with first-degree murder and held without bail. The case drew national attention, with the media focusing on the contradictions in Mark's public persona and the cold, calculated nature of the crime. The trial promised to reveal everything. When Mark Wilson's trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. The prosecution, armed with an overwhelming body of evidence, wasted no time. They carefully outlined the chain of events leading to Katie's murder, a chilling story of jealousy, control, and premeditated violence. Detective Laura Simpson, the lead investigator, was the prosecution's first witness. She guided the jury through the timeline, exposing inconsistencies in Mark's alibi. Although he claimed to have been in another city on business the night Katie vanished, hotel records told a different story. His check-in time was later than he'd claimed, and a witness recalled seeing a vehicle matching his near Maplewood that night. The forensic evidence was damning. Detective Simpson detailed how Mark's DNA was found under Katie's fingernails, proof of a struggle, and how his blood had been discovered on her clothing. The method of murder, the concealed body, and the manipulation of the alibi all pointed in one direction: Mark Wilson. Next, the jury heard from Sarah, Katie's close friend and co-worker. Her testimony was deeply emotional. She described how Katie had lived in fear during the final months of her marriage, how Mark's behavior had grown more controlling, his jealousy more intense. Katie had spoken of feeling trapped, of being watched, of not knowing how to escape the marriage without triggering Mark's anger. Sarah's words painted a portrait of a woman desperate to regain her freedom, yet fearful of what her husband might do. Then came Lisa Crawford. Though she denied any involvement in the murder, her testimony further damaged Mark's credibility. She revealed that he had frequently talked about his crumbling marriage and his inability to accept Katie pulling away from him. He feared losing control, losing his family, and on the night of the murder, he called her calm and collected. Just before everything unraveled, the medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. Katie's death was not quick. She was killed with a piece of her own clothing, an act of rage and familiarity. Her body had been left in the woods, covered in debris, in a feeble attempt to hide the crime. The evidence, both emotional and forensic, painted a horrifying picture of domestic violence, taken to its most extreme conclusion. The man who couldn't stand the thought of losing his wife didn't just try to stop her from leaving. He killed her to ensure she never could in the end. The jury found Mark Wilson guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Katie Wilson's story is one of heartbreak, control, and a tragic end to a young life full of promise. Her case serves as a reminder of the silent struggles many face behind closed doors, and the deadly consequences that can follow when fear and control turn to violence. The medical examiner testified that the bruises on Katie's body were consistent with defensive wounds, clear signs that she had fought back. This critical evidence painted a haunting picture of Katie's final moments, as she tried desperately to protect herself from the man she once trusted. As the prosecution concluded its case, the defense began presenting its arguments. Mark's attorney, Robert Harris, attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's evidence. He suggested that the phone records could have been misinterpreted, that the gas station sighting was inconclusive, and that another unknown person might have exploited Mark's absence to commit the crime. Harris even tried to downplay the DNA found beneath Katie's fingernails, claiming it could have been the result of an innocent, everyday interaction. Despite his efforts, Harris's arguments faltered under the weight of overwhelming forensic and circumstantial evidence. He portrayed Mark as a grieving husband struggling to cope with loss and scrutiny. But the jury wasn't swayed. The facts spoke louder than any emotional plea throughout the trial. Mark Wilson remained largely composed, though occasional flashes of emotion flickered across his face. He often appeared disconnected from the proceedings, as if watching them unfold from a distance. At times, he glanced at the jury with an expression of disbelief, seemingly unable to comprehend why the evidence so clearly implicated him. But even his detached demeanor couldn't erase the growing tension in the courtroom. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. Lead prosecutor Michael Thompson reminded the jury of the brutality of Katie's murder, the signs of her struggle, and the damning forensic evidence linking Mark to the crime. He spoke of the life Katie had lost, the future stolen from her and her children, and of the betrayal she suffered at the hands of the man who was supposed to love and protect her. Thompson urged the jury to see through the defense's attempts at confusion and deliver justice in response. The defense leaned heavily on the concept of reasonable doubt. Harris urged the jury to question law enforcement's conclusions, to scrutinize the chain of evidence, and to consider the possibility of another perpetrator. But it was too little, too late. The jury remained unmoved after several days of deliberation. They returned a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion, tears of relief, sorrow, and closure. Katie's family, present every day of the trial, wept quietly. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Katie back. Mark sat motionless as the verdict was read, his once scum exterior now betraying a hint of finality. The man who had maintained his innocence for so long now faced the reality of life behind bars. The judge's sentencing was firm and unwavering. Mark Wilson was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final remarks, the judge addressed the devastation Mark had caused to Katie, to their children, and to the entire community. Mark would never walk free again. The violence he had unleashed in an attempt to preserve control had destroyed everything he once claimed to love. Katie Wilson's murder left a lasting scar on the town of Maplewood. The shock of her death, the chilling unraveling of Mark's double life, and the emotionally charged pursuit of justice echoed throughout the community. For years to come, Katie's children, now left without both parents, would grow up carrying the heavy burden of loss, the memory of the mother taken from them, and the father who had taken her. Yet in the midst of tragedy, Katie's memory endured. Her friends, family, and colleagues honored her life by supporting causes she had cared about, particularly healthcare and children's welfare. In the years following the trial, a scholarship was created in her name to help young women pursuing careers in nursing, though her life was tragically cut short. Katie Wilson's legacy lived on in the lives she touched and the people she inspired. Mark Wilson, now imprisoned, would spend his remaining days haunted by the irreversible consequences of his actions, like she had simply vanished without a trace. Emily Clark's disappearance initially stirred more confusion than urgency in those early days. The investigation was quiet. There were no signs of a struggle at her apartment, no suspicious witnesses, no clear path to follow. Police combed through her social media activity, spoke with her family, and interviewed her friends, but nothing they uncovered offered any solid lead. Only detail that raised concern was a brief mention of a man named David Foster. Emily had spoken about him to her friend Sarah the night before she disappeared. David was a recent arrival in the town of well groomed, and in his mid-30s, he had rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town and kept a low profile. Very little was known about him. As investigators began to dig deeper, more questions than answers emerged. David had no close ties in town. His previous employers from other states offered only vague references. Some described him as charming and well-spoken. Others called him reserved, even reclusive, while he avoided most social gatherings. He had been spotted with Emily on several occasions there. Was something about their relationships, something unspoken that caught the investigators' attention. Especially troubling was David's absence when police first tried to question him at his cottage. When they finally located him days later, David claimed he had been visiting a friend in a nearby city during the time of Emily's disappearance, but his alibi was shaky. There were no hotel records, no confirmed sightings, and no one to back up his story, despite growing suspicion. The police lacked concrete evidence to hold him. David Foster was now a person of interest as the search intensified. Law enforcement joined forces with volunteers to scour the surrounding forests, walking trails, and parks areas Emily was known to frequent. They even searched the small lake just beyond town, a favorite summer spot of hers, but there was still no sign of Emily. As days turned into weeks, dread settled over Evergreen. What had happened to Emily Clark? Then came a breakthrough during a follow-up interview. One of Emily's closest friends, Lisa, Matt, revealed something disturbing. She had recently gone through some of Emily's old emails and stumbled upon a series of unsettling exchanges between Emily and David. The tone of the messages painted a troubling picture. Their relationship, once seemingly romantic, had spiraled into something toxic. David had become increasingly controlling, demanding more of Emily's time, questioning her loyalty, and pushing her to isolate from others. Emily, in turn, expressed fear and discomfort in one of her final messages. She wrote that she needed space, but she feared how David might respond. Lisa hadn't known how serious things had become until she reread those messages to the police. However, they were a red flag. The emotional manipulation, the control, the fear, it all pointed to a man who couldn't accept rejection. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered more alarming details. David had been stalking Emily more aggressively than anyone had realized. He had started appearing at places she frequented uninvited and unannounced. Most disturbingly, he had secretly installed a tracking device on her car, monitoring her every move. With this new evidence in hand, authorities obtained a search warrant for David Foster's cottage. What they found inside turned suspicion into horror. Hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom was a cache of Emily's belongings, personal items she hadn't even known were missing, candid photos taken without her consent, and a chilling handwritten journal inside its pages. David detailed every interaction with Emily, his growing obsession, and the anger he felt as she began to pull away. One passage stood out above all. He wrote of his desire to make her mine forever, no matter what it took. That journal became the final piece of the puzzle, piecing together the timeline. Investigators determined that on the night of her disappearance, David had shown up at Emily's apartment uninvited. They argued. Things escalated quickly. Emily fought back hard, but ultimately, David overpowered her. He then transported her body to a secluded riverside location, just miles from his cottage there. He tried to conceal her remains beneath fallen branches. He's recovered her body soon after, on July 30th, 2002. Weeks after Emily vanished, David Foster was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The revelation shocked Evergreen. Many residents had seen David around town, maybe even spoken to him. To imagine that this soft-spoken, seemingly polite man had been hiding such violent obsessions was almost incomprehensibly. As the truth came to light, fear rippled through the community. People began to look more closely at the relationships around them, questioning whether anyone they knew could be hiding such sinister secrets for Emily's loved ones. The grief was immeasurable. Her parents, devastated, were forced to confront a future without their only daughter. Her friends struggled with guilt, wondering how someone like David had slipped through their watchful eyes. Investigators widened their search into David's past, looking for other warning signs, other victims. The quiet town of Evergreen would never be the same again. As the investigation into Emily Clark's murder deepened, authorities were determined to understand what had driven David Foster to commit such a horrific crime. The more they uncovered, the more chilling his obsession appeared. David's life, it turned out, had been a long pattern of emotionally abusive relationships, each marked by control, manipulation, and a disturbing inability to let go. His former girlfriends painted a hauntingly similar picture. A man who, in the beginning, was affectionate, attentive, and charismatic, but who quickly became possessive, paranoid, and emotionally suffocating. One woman recalled how, near the end of their relationship, David had accused her of cheating and tracked her movements obsessively. Another described how he had once appeared at her apartment uninvited, demanding to know where she'd been and who she was with. These were not isolated incidents, they were patterns. But what had made his relationship with Emily different? Why had this one ended in murder? Investigators came to a disturbing conclusion. It was how David viewed relationships not as partnerships between two people, but as possessions to be owned and controlled. Emily's independence, her successful career, and her ability to create a life beyond him had threatened David's fragile sense of control. Her desire for autonomy became, in his mind, a direct challenge to his authority. And David Foster was not a man who took rejection lightly at first. Things between them had seemed normal. Emily, like others before her, had been drawn to David's confidence and charm. He made her feel special, seen. But as their relationship progressed, red flags began to emerge. His need for reassurance became constant. He grew clingy, demanding, and jealous, monitoring her social life, questioning her every move. Emily had tried to end the relationship several times. Each attempt was met with denial. David refused to let her go, promising change, swearing he could be the man she needed. But Emily had seen the truth behind the mask. His love wasn't real, it was obsession, and it was growing darker by the day. The final turning point came when Emily told David she needed space-time to focus on her career and rediscover herself. It was a reasonable, respectful request, but to David, it was betrayal. He couldn't fathom why someone he believed he owned would want to leave him. His obsession boiled over into rage. The emails Emily sent to her friend Lisa in those final days revealed her mounting fear. She wrote about feeling trapped and worried about how David might react if she tried to sever ties for good. She feared that if she didn't act soon, she might never get the chance to. In the evening of July 15th, Emily agreed to meet David one last time. The plan was simple, a calm, final conversation closure. But David had no intention of letting her go. Consumed by rage and unable to accept her decision, he lashed out. What was meant to be a goodbye turned deadly in the chaos of a violent struggle. David strangled Emily. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a sudden loss of control. It was the end result of weeks, perhaps months so, of escalating manipulation and possessiveness. David had decided that if he couldn't have Emily, no one wouldn't. After taking her life, he didn't turn himself in. He didn't show remorse. Instead, he went to great lengths to cover up the crime, transporting her body to a remote location, hiding it and returning to town as if nothing had happened. He smiled. He lied. He pretended Emily had simply disappeared on her own. David Foster's arrest marked a turning point, not just in the investigation, but for the town of Evergreen itself. The brutal murder of a bright, talented young woman at the hands of someone she once trusted shattered the community's sense of safety. The idea that such violence could fester in plain sight, beneath the surface of what had once seemed like a normal relationship, left Evergreen shaken. Emily Clark became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of what happens when obsession, control, and violence are allowed to masquerade as love. As the trial approached, the town braced itself for the harrowing details to be brought into the open. The courtroom would become a battleground of painful truths and irreparable loss. Family, still reeling from her death, sat silently through every moment of the proceedings. Her parents, faces etched with sorrow, listened as prosecutors laid out the horrifying facts. The prosecution's case was anchored by the evidence discovered in David's cottage's secret journal, the voyeuristic photos, the obsessive emails. These weren't the remnants of a troubled romance. They were the blueprints of a calculated, controlling predator. Prosecutors argued that David's desire to control Emily had evolved into a lethal fixation. Her attempts to leave, to reclaim her life, had cost her everything. The defense painted a different picture. David's attorneys argued that the murder wasn't premeditated, but instead the tragic result of emotional overload. They claimed he had snapped in the heat of the moment, driven by heartbreak and fear of abandonment. They acknowledged his obsessive behavior, but asked the jury to believe he hadn't meant to kill her. But the jury wasn't convinced. The pattern of control, the detailed journal entries, and the deliberate efforts to hide Emily's body left little doubt this had been no accident. This had been a decision. The lack of remorse in David's actions sealed his fate in the end. David Foster was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a measure of justice. But no punishment could bring Emily back. Her absence left a silence in the lives of all who knew and loved her still. Her story became a warning, a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked obsession and emotional abuse. Emily's name now stands not just for tragedy, but for truth and for the vow her family and friends made in her memory: to speak out, to stand up, and to never mistake control for love. Against story 5 in July 2000. Dallas, Texas was gripped by a chilling tragedy that sent shockwaves throughout the city. The brutal murder of 34-year-old Catherine Malera, respected investigative journalist, shattered the sense of safety in a community that had long admired her fearless pursuit of truth. Catherine had earned a reputation at one of Dallas's leading newspapers for her relentless commitment to justice. Her colleagues knew her as a passionate and determined reporter, often burning the midnight oil to expose wrongdoing and amplify the voices of the marginalized. Though her work was demanding, she led a quiet and private personal life, residing alone in a sleek high-rise apartment downtown. The floor 2 windows of her 18th floor unit overlooked the city she both loved and held accountable. On the morning of July 12th, a concerned neighbor, an elderly woman living across the hall, noticed something strange. Catherine, who typically left early for work, had not emerged from her apartment after knocking several times and receiving no answer. The uneasy neighbor contacted the building's management to request a wellness check. When the superintendent unlocked Catherine's door, he was met with a horrifying scene. The apartment was in complete disarray: furniture overturned, drawers yanked open, papers strewn across the floor. Catherine's body lay motionless in the living room. Her clothes were torn, her body bloodied, and the signs of a violent struggle were unmistakable. Most alarming of all, there was no sign of forced entry. Police were immediately called to the scene. The investigation began with a grim clarity. This was no accident, and certainly not a burglary gone wrong. Catherine had been viciously beaten with a blunt object, and signs of strangulation indicated a deeply personal attack. Forensics combed the apartment for trace evidence, collecting strands of hair and fibers for further analysis. Detectives were faced with a daunting challenge. With no forced entry, They theorized that Catherine had known or willingly let in her attacker. Yet she had no known enemies, and those closest to her described her personal life as guarded and free of drama. Her work, however, painted a different picture only days before her death. Catherine had published a piece that exposed corruption within the local police department, though no direct threats had been made. Some of her colleagues believed the timing of her murder was too coincidental to ignore. Still, the police lacked any conclusive connection between the story and her death as investigators dug deeper. They turned to those who knew Catherine best. Among them was Sarah Daniels. Her closest friend and fellow journalist Sarah revealed a significant lead just hours before her murder. Catherine had confided in her about an ongoing investigation involving Richard Grayson, a powerful Dallas businessman with a squeaky clean public image, but a shadowy reputation behind the scenes. Grayson, a self-made millionaire and owner of a luxury restaurant empire, had long been the subject of whispered rumors. Catherine had been quietly building a case against him for months, hinting to Sarah that she was on the verge of uncovering something explosive, though she hadn't revealed all the details. She did mention she had arranged a meeting with a confidential source who claimed to have definitive proof of Grayson's illegal dealings. Catherine had been cautious, perhaps even fearful, according to Sarah. She warned her not to trust anyone, and had even written down her notes and source list in a secured folder hidden in her apartment. But when detectives searched her home, that folder was nowhere to be found. That investigators pursued this lead. They faced increasing pressure from the public, from the media, and from Catherine's family, who demanded justice for the woman they loved and admired. Her mother, in particular, became a powerful advocate for the case. Speaking to the press, after every court hearing, Catherine was more than a victim. She would say she was a daughter, a friend, a voice for the voiceless. We will not let her be forgotten. While grief consumed those who loved her, the investigation pressed on, fueled not just by the brutal nature of the crime, but by the chilling realization that Catherine may have been silenced for getting too close to the truth. Catherine had told her close friend, Sarah Daniels, that she would be meeting Richard Grayson that evening, what she described as a face-to-face confrontation. She hadn't shared the details, but Sarah wasn't surprised. Catherine had a history of using a potent mix of charm, fearlessness, and assertiveness to draw information from even the most powerful people. She wasn't reckless, but she was bold, and sometimes dangerously so. At first, the idea that Richard Grayson, a polished, well-connected Dallas businessman, could be involved in Catherine's death felt far-fetched. Rumors about his shady business practices had floated around for years, but nothing had ever stuck. He remained a local celebrity of sorts, untouchable, and always well-defended. Still, detectives couldn't ignore Catherine's notes or Sarah's testimony. They reached out to Grayson's legal team and arranged a formal interview when Grayson appeared for questioning. He was polite, but visibly uneasy. He denied any connection to Catherine's murder, and even claimed that he had never met her in person, despite the fact that she had published several exposes involving his businesses. He offered an alibi. He had been at a private corporate event the night Catherine was killed, and several attendees vouched for his presence, but something about his demeanor unsettled the detectives. Grayson was evasive, carefully choosing his words, especially when asked about any recent contact with Catherine. The case took a critical turn when forensic analysts completed testing on hair and fiber samples collected from Catherine's apartment. Among them was a single hair that didn't match hers. When the DNA was run through the system, it came back with a match. Marcus Blackwell, a former cook at one of Grayson's upscale restaurants. Blackwell had a criminal record, including multiple arrests for assault. Digging deeper, investigators learned that Blackwell had been abruptly fired several months earlier under suspicious circumstances. But that wasn't all. Marcus Blackwell had also been a confidential source for Catherine, contributing to a prior investigation. She had written on exploitative labor practices in the Dallas restaurant industry, including those linked to Grayson's empire. It soon became clear that Marcus and Catherine had recently been in contact. Text messages recovered from her phone showed Marcus growing increasingly agitated, venting about Grayson and how he'd been treated. He felt discarded and disrespected, and his tone hinted at revenge. Detectives began to suspect that Marcus hadn't acted alone. Phone records revealed several calls between Blackwell and a number registered to Grayson's office in the week leading up to Catherine's death. Surveillance footage from the night of her murder showed a car resembling Grayson's parked near her apartment building, while the driver wasn't identifiable. The timing was suspicious, too close to the murder to ignore. Further analysis of Marcus's phone logs showed that he had contacted Grayson directly several times. That same evening, the calls stopped just hours before Catherine's body was discovered. The theory that emerged was disturbing. Grayson may have orchestrated the attack, using Marcus as a pawn. Catherine's investigation had been threatening to expose Grayson's underhanded practices, and he had every motive to silence her before she went public. Marcus, meanwhile, was vulnerable, angry, and easily manipulated. After days of searching, police located Marcus Blackwell, who had gone into hiding after the murder. Upon arrest, he was initially silent, but after prolonged questioning, Marcus cracked. His confession was chilling. Marcus admitted to being inside Catherine's apartment the night she died, but he claimed the plan had not been to kill her. According to him, Grayson had promised him money and debt forgiveness in exchange for intimidating Catherine into backing off her investigation. Marcus said he was desperate. He feared Grayson, and he needed the money, but things had quickly spiraled out of control. Catherine fought back, screaming and resisting. The situation escalated. Marcus claimed that during the chaos, Grayson himself showed up at the apartment. The two men argued then. According to Marcus, Grayson coldly ordered him to finish it. Grayson allegedly insisted that there was no going back, that Catherine knew too much, and letting her live was no longer an option. Frightened and unsure, Marcus said he followed the order together. The two men brutally attacked Catherine despite the confession. Detectives weren't finished. They needed more than words. They combed through Grayson's financial records and personal files, and what they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Offshore accounts, unexplained transactions, links to organized crime. It was the foundation of an empire built on fraud, fear, and coercion. Catherine had been close to revealing it. All her murder wasn't random, it was calculated. A preemptive strike to preserve a carefully crafted illusion of respectability. Richard Grayson had used his wealth and influence to hide the rot beneath the surface, but in silencing Catherine, he had only exposed more. As the investigation deepened and charges were brought against both men, the city of Dallas was forced to confront the darkness hidden behind its glittering skyline and remember the brave journalist who had given her life, trying to uncover Ito, protect his secrets. Richard Grayson was willing to go to any lengths, and it was that desperate need for control that ultimately revealed his motive. Forensic investigators discovered Grayson's fingerprints on several items inside Catherine Miller's apartment, including a drinking glass on the living room coffee table. This contradicted Grayson's firm denial of ever being there. Combined with the explosive testimony from Marcus Blackwell, it became impossible to dismiss Grayson's involvement. Just 6 days after Catherine's murder, on July 18, 2000, the police arrested Richard Grayson. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Grayson had been a respected philanthropist and a successful businessman, widely admired for his contributions to local charities and the city's economic development. That such a man could be behind a violent murder was unthinkable to many. But the mounting evidence told a much darker story as Grayson was led away from his mansion in handcuffs. Media crews flooded the scene, still maintaining his innocence. Grayson gave public statements that grew increasingly frantic and contradictory. He claimed Marcus had acted alone, and that he knew nothing of any plan to harm Catherine, but detectives were confident they had already built a timeline backed by evidence that painted Grayson not as a bystander, but as the orchestrator of the crime. Catherine's family, devastated by her loss, found some solace in seeing justice begin to unfold. Her father expressed quiet relief at Grayson's arrest, knowing how tirelessly his daughter had worked to exposed corruption, that her life had been taken in an effort to silence her only deepened their grief. But they found comfort in the fact that the people responsible were finally being held accountable. The case captured headlines across Dallas, exposing a side of the city's elite that few had dared confront as investigations into Grayson's ties to organized crime and illegal business practices expanded. It became clear Catherine's murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was a calculated move to protect a crumbling empire. When the trial began, the courtroom overflowed with spectators, reporters, and law enforcement officials. The city watched closely, waiting to see whether justice would prevail. Richard Grayson, once a beacon of power and prestige, now sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his demeanor cold, his eyes unreadable. The prosecution presented a compelling case. They argued that Grayson had manipulated Marcus Blackwell, using him as a pawn to carry out the murder. The evidence supported this theory. Cell phone records showed Grayson and Marcus had communicated on the night of Catherine's murder, and forensic analysis placed Grayson directly at the scene. Marcus's testimony became the trial's emotional centerpiece. Tearfully, he recounted how Grayson had pressured him to kill Catherine, framing it as the only way to protect their criminal interests. Marcus admitted he had believed Grayson when he said eliminating Catherine was necessary to preserve everything they'd built. The courtroom sat in silence as Marcus broke down, consumed by remorse, unable to discredit Marcus's testimony. The defense shifted tactics. They attempted to portray Grayson as a man caught in circumstances beyond his control. They suggested that while Grayson's business dealings may have been unethical, he had never intended for Catherine to be killed, that Marcus had acted on his own in a fit of rage. But the argument failed to resonate with each passing day. The evidence mounted. Forensic experts testified that DNA evidence linked Grayson to the scene. Prosecutors presented emails and text messages revealing Grayson's growing obsession with silencing Catherine. In the days before her death, the murder, they said, was not impulsive, was premeditated and deliberate. Catherine's colleagues from the newspaper also took the stand. They painted a portrait of a fearless journalist committed to the truth, someone who had never backed down in the face of power. Her editor, Jack Thompson, recalled Catherine's unwavering resolve to finish the story she had been working on. Even as threats against her mounted, she wasn't afraid of them, he told the court, his voice cracking. She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't do the right thing. By the end of the trial, the prosecution had laid out a case that left no room for doubt. Richard Grayson had masterminded the murder of Catherine Miller. The defense failed to offer a credible alternative. The weight of the evidence crushed any hope of acquittal as the jury deliberated. Catherine's family waited, hoping for justice, bracing for more pain. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Richard Grayson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and a host of charges tied to his criminal enterprise. For Catherine's family, the verdict did not erase their grief, but it did give them the one thing they had fought so hard to see: accountability. Catherine had died in vain. Her work had exposed the truth, and in the end, it was that truth that brought down the man who had tried to silence her story. 6. The disappearance and murder of Laura Benetton, August 2000. The quiet town of Oakwood, Ohio, was shaken by a case that began as a missing persons report, but quickly spiraled into a chilling tale of betrayal, obsession, and murder. The victim was 36-year-old Laura Bennett, a well-loved schoolteacher at Oakwood Middle School, known for her warmth, dedication, and deep involvement in her community. Laura's sudden disappearance stunned everyone who knew her. At first, there seemed to be no cause for alarm. Laura had been planning a weekend getaway to a lakeside cabin with her fiancé, Mark Stevens. They had been engaged for 6 months, and to the outside world, their relationship appeared happy and stable. On the morning of August 10th, however, Laura failed to show up for work. Her absence was initially dismissed as a possible early start to her vacation, but as the hours ticked by, with no word from her, concern began to mount. Even more troubling was the fact that Mark, who had been in constant contact with Laura, was suddenly unreachable. His phone went straight to voicemail, and he failed to respond to calls from Laura's friends and family by that evening. Panic had set in. Laura's mother, Karen Bennett, contacted the Oakwood Police Department and officially reported her daughter missing. What started as a routine investigation soon took a sinister turn. The first major breakthrough came when Laura's car was found abandoned on a rural road outside of town. The vehicle was locked, with no signs of a struggle. Inside were Laura's purse, her cell phone, and a sealed bottle of water. Odd, considering she had no reason to stop there, and nothing inside the car appeared out of place. But to investigators, the eerie calmness of the scene only deepened the mystery. Then came the texts. Police retrieved a series of late-night messages exchanged between Laura and Mark the evening before she vanished. The conversation started off innocently, but became increasingly alarming just after midnight. Mark sent a chilling message. "You don't know what I've done," Laura replied with confusion. But Mark never responded again the next morning. The messages abruptly stopped. Interviews with Laura's friends revealed that things hadn't been as perfect as they seemed. Laura had recently voiced concerns about Mark's erratic behavior. He had grown possessive, controlling, even paranoid. One colleague recalled that Laura had begun to withdraw socially and had expressed doubts about continuing the relationship. She had not yet made a decision, but she was clearly uneasy. This new information placed Mark squarely in the police's crosshairs. His whereabouts during the crucial hours surrounding Laura's disappearance were unclear, and phone data revealed that he had been near the location where her car was abandoned. Something he failed to mention. The community watched in horror as the case unfolded. Oakwood, a town unaccustomed to violent crime, became the focus of national headlines, and as the investigation intensified, so did the revelations about Mark Stevens. A deeper dive into his past revealed a troubling history of failed relationships, marked by obsessive and sometimes dangerous behavior. Former partners described his escalating jealousy and controlling tendencies. One ex-girlfriend had even taken out a restraining order after Mark repeatedly followed her and showed up uninvited at her workplace. These incidents, once scattered and unconnected, now painted a picture of a man capable of something far worse. Then, on August 16th, came the turning point. Mark was arrested after he attempted to sell Laura's car at a local dealership using forged paperwork. A suspicious employee tipped off police, who quickly took Mark into custody. At first, he claimed that Laura had left him and disappeared on her own, but a search of his apartment turned later. A hidden storage unit told a different story. Inside the apartment, police found dozens of photos of Laura taken without her knowledge, handwritten letters expressing obsessive love, and a journal filled with disturbing thoughts about their relationship. But the most damning discoveries were in the storage unit Mark had secretly rented. Laura's suitcase, some of her clothing, and a box of her personal mementos. A bloodstained shirt and a pair of shoes with traces of blood sealed the case. Laura had not vanished. She had been murdered. With this evidence, the investigation officially shifted from a missing person to a homicide. Mark Stevens was charged with the murder of Laura Bennett, as well as kidnapping and theft. He was denied bail while police continued to build their case. The town of Oakwood was left in mourning, struggling to reconcile the warm, hopeful image of Laura with the dark and twisted reality of her death. Her case became a sobering reminder of how dangerous hidden obsessions can be, and how even the most seemingly picture-perfect relationships can conceal devastating secrets. Of disappearance and murder of Laura Bennett, Part 2. As police prepared to formally charge Mark Stevens, the search for Laura Bennett's body intensified. Investigators were determined to bring her home and give her grieving family the closure they so desperately needed. While the evidence pointing to Mark's guilt was already substantial, Laura's whereabouts remained a haunting mystery, and so, the case was far from over. In the small town of Oakwood, disbelief hung heavy. How could such a horrifying crime happen in their close-knit community? What could possibly have driven Mark Stevens to murder the woman he once claimed to love? The investigation into Laura's disappearance continued to unfold rapidly. Mark's arrest had rocked the town to its core. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers were left, reeling, unable to reconcile the image of a calm, affectionate fiancé with the horrifying possibility that he had taken Laura's life. But in hindsight, the signs had been their subtle cracks in the seemingly perfect relationship. Laura's friends began to reflect on the past few weeks, realizing how withdrawn she had become, how uneasy she had seemed. The changes in Mark's behavior had gone unnoticed by most, but now, in the light of tragedy, the truth was emerging. With Mark in custody and mounting evidence against him, investigators pressed on. Forensic teams scoured every inch of his apartment, his car, and any properties linked to him, but it was the discovery of a hidden storage unit that provided the most chilling insight. Inside, detectives found a disturbing collection of personal belongings: Laura's suitcase, articles of her clothing, and cherished mementos, items Mark had clearly taken after her disappearance. Most disturbing of all were Mark's journals. The pages offered a glimpse into a mind unraveling in these entries. Mark documented a growing obsession. His love for Laura had twisted into a possessive fixation. He wrote about fearing abandonment, about his jealousy, and his deepening need to control her. The journals revealed how that fear metastasized into paranoia. Laura, unaware of just how deep this darkness went, had begun to notice troubling changes. She confided in friends that Mark had become controlling, showing up uninvited, questioning her whereabouts, demanding to know who she was speaking to. She had begun to fear the intensity of his attachment. Friends encouraged her to talk to him, to create space, but Laura, ever compassionate, hesitated. She believed things would get better, that maybe he just needed reassurance. Was a tragic miscalculation. Laura had planned to use their upcoming weekend trip to gain clarity, some distance to reflect on their relationship. She was seeking space, but Mark, investigators would later suggest, had other plans. As police combed through the timeline of Laura's disappearance, inconsistencies in Mark's story stood out. He claimed he had dropped Laura off at the lake for a walk and then returned home, but cell phone data told a different story. He had been near a remote wooded area, not far from where Laura's car was later found. Then, on August 21st, came the grim breakthrough. A hiker stumbled upon human remains in a secluded area near the lake. The body had been partially buried beneath a pile of leaves. Authorities were immediately dispatched to the scene, and forensic analysis soon confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Laura Bennett. The condition of her body suggested she had been killed shortly after her disappearance. There were no immediate signs of external trauma, but the autopsy later revealed that Laura had been strangled, murdered by someone she had once trusted completely. When confronted with the discovery, Mark Stevens maintained his innocence, but the evidence had reached a tipping point. The contents of the storage unit, the surveillance footage, the digital footprints, it was all damning now. With Laura's body found, investigators had the final piece of the puzzle. News of her death spread rapidly through Oakwood. The reaction was one of heartbreak and outrage. Laura wasn't just a victim, she had been a pillar of her community. Her students adored her, her colleagues respected her, and her neighbors cherished her presence. No one could believe that Mark, the man she had planned to marry, was responsible for such a brutal betrayal. His trial began in early 2001. The defense argued that Mark had suffered a psychological break, that his obsession had driven him into a state of temporary insanity, but the prosecution painted a far more sinister picture, one of careful, deliberate planning and control. Mark's writings, his stalking behavior, and the attempt to dispose of Laura's body all pointed to premeditation. Mark Stevens wasn't just obsessed, he was dangerous, and in the end, the jury agreed he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the people of Oakwood, the verdict brought little comfort. Nothing could bring Laura back, nothing could erase the pain of what had been lost. Her family, especially her mother, Karen, struggled to move forward. They had raised Laura with love, watched her grow into a woman who touched so many lives. Now they were left with memories and grief. But in that grief, Karen found purpose. She established a scholarship fund in Laura's name, offering educational support to underprivileged students at Oakwood Middle School, the same place where Laura had inspired so many young minds. It was a way to honor her legacy, to ensure that her life would continue to make a difference. Friends and colleagues created their own tribute candlelight vigils, memorial events, and awareness campaigns against domestic violence. Through their actions, Laura's memory lived on. The murder of Laura Bennett changed Oakwood forever. It was a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist behind even the most picture-perfect relationships. And though the town slowly began to heal, it would never forget the beloved teacher whose light had been stolen too. Soon the murder of Laura Bennett, aftermath and legacy. The disappearance and eventual discovery of Laura Bennett's body shocked the town of Oakwood to its core. But as the dust began to settle, one truth became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a case of murder. It was a devastating portrait of a controlling relationship that spiraled into tragedy. In the early stages of the investigation, many had overlooked the subtle warning signs, the power dynamics, and the emotional abuse that had silently built up behind closed doors. Mark Stevens didn't just take Laura's life, he stole her voice, the voice of a woman who had once been vibrant, outspoken, and full of hope. Her death became a painful symbol of the dangers of possessive love and the fatal consequences of control, masquerading as affection. In the months that followed, Oakwood changed. The once peaceful town, known for its quiet streets and friendly neighbors, became more vigilant, more watchful. The community, still in mourning, began to acknowledge the realities of domestic abuse, especially in relationships that looked perfect on the outside. Laura's case was no longer just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. Support for domestic violence victims surged across Oakwood. Local organizations launched new initiatives to educate the public on the early signs of coercion and psychological abuse. Workshops, school seminars, and public service campaigns urged people to speak up before things could escalate. Laura's story was at the heart of it all. Meanwhile, Mark Stevens began serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. Prison was a cold, unforgiving place for a man like him. His former charm, once used to manipulate and deceive, held no power behind bars. He quickly became isolated, reviled by fellow inmates who refused to associate with a man convicted of such a brutal and calculated act. Gone were the days when Mark was viewed as Oakwood's friendly, well-mannered neighbor. That image had been forever shattered. His obsession with Laura, once hidden beneath a mask of devotion, now stood exposed for the world to see. He had become a cautionary tale, a living example of how control, when left unchecked, can become deadly. Mark's life behind bars was bleak, with no friends and few supporters. The only connection he maintained with the outside world came through sporadic letters from his family. The tone of those letters was conflicted, filled with disappointment, anger, but also a lingering trace of love. They had lost their son, not to an accident or injustice, but to his own horrifying choices, and now they were left mourning a man who no longer existed. As Mark faded into the shadows of prison life, the media coverage around the case refused to die down. Laura's story was told and retold in headlines, television specials, and documentaries. Her face, bright, kind, hopeful, became a haunting reminder of the woman the town had lost. But the legal chapter of this story, with all its evidence and courtroom tension, was only part of the lasting impact. Karen Bennett, Laura's mother, was transformed by grief. Once a woman full of warmth and joy, she now carried a sorrow that never quite lifted. Each birthday, each anniversary of Laura's disappearance, her death, and the trial verdict was a fresh wound. But Karen chose to fight through the pain. She refused to let her daughter's death be the end of the story. Karen became an advocate, loud and unwavering, for victims of domestic violence. She traveled across the state, sharing Laura's story, urging lawmakers to strengthen protections for abuse survivors, and speaking to young women about the red flags Laura had missed or minimized out of unimaginable loss. She built something meaningful back in Oakwood. Laura's legacy grew stronger with each passing year. A scholarship in her name helped underprivileged students pursue education, a tribute to her passion as a teacher. The classrooms where she once taught became sacred ground for many colleagues' organized candlelight vigils. Her students, many now adults, continued to speak of the impact she had made on their lives, though her life had been stolen. Laura became more than a victim. She became a symbol of resilience, a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, a reminder that one tragic ending could ignite meaningful change. And Oakwood, it would never be the same. The town held its breath whenever new stories of domestic abuse surfaced in the news. Neighbors paid more attention, friends asked more questions. The memory of Laura Bennett served as a quiet but powerful force, urging the community to remain vigilant and compassionate. Mark Stevens had destroyed one life, but in the wake of his crime, an entire movement had been born. Justice had been served. The man responsible would never walk free again. But more importantly, Laura's story continued to live in every classroom, in every workshop, in every survivor who found the strength to live. Laura Bennett was gone, but her voice, once silenced, now echoed louder than ever. The disappearance of Sarah Mitchell, unraveling the illusion. At first, it was treated as a routine missing persons case, but as the hours turned into days, and there was still no sign of Sarah Mitchell, investigators began to suspect that something far more sinister had occurred. John Mitchell, Sarah's husband, was the first person detectives questioned. His version of events was vague and inconsistent. He claimed the last time he saw Sarah was the night before when they went to bed. According to John, Sarah had seemed upset, though he couldn't say why. He said he woke the next morning to find her gone with no note, no explanation, and no trace. Detectives immediately noted John's demeanor. He wasn't frantic, he wasn't emotional. His calmness felt out of place, almost cold given the circumstances. It was difficult for officers to overlook how emotionally detached he appeared, while many spouses in similar situations would be panicked. John came off as disturbingly composed, and that set off alarm bells. Detective Sarah Harding, who was leading the investigation, began to look deeper into the couple's marriage. She reached out to Sarah's close friends, colleagues, and family, hoping to uncover who Sarah Mitchell truly was behind the smiling photos and the quiet suburban life. What she found was deeply unsettling. According to friends, Sarah had been growing increasingly unhappy in her marriage, while no one reported seeing signs of physical abuse. There had been mounting emotional strain. Sarah had privately confided in a few trusted friends that John had become possessive, jealous, and controlling. She had started to feel trapped. In fact, in the months leading up to her disappearance, Sarah had expressed serious doubts about the future of their relationship. She wanted to leave, but wasn't sure how. Detective Harding also learned that Sarah had recently opened a separate bank account, one she hadn't told John about. Her coworkers at the local middle school had noticed changes too. Sarah had become withdrawn, quieter than usual when asked about her home life. She would brush off questions or deflect with vague answers. The Mitchells had been married for over 10 years, but the image of their perfect marriage was beginning to crack. Then came a turning point. Sarah's phone revealed a string of text messages she had sent to her best friend, Melissa, just days before she vanished. The messages were deeply concerning. In one, Sarah wrote, "I can't take this anymore. I need to leave before it's too late." In another, she admitted, "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending." These messages painted a troubling picture. Sarah had been planning to leave John, and something, or someone, had stopped her. With suspicion mounting, detectives obtained a warrant to search the Mitchell home. In the basement, behind a false wall panel, they discovered a hidden safe. Inside were Sarah's personal belongings, jewelry, handwritten notes, and most disturbingly, photographs of her taken without her knowledge. The images were from around the house, in the kitchen, the backyard, even while she slept. This wasn't just surveillance, it was obsession. Investigators believed John had been stalking his own wife within their home. The hidden belongings suggested he was attempting to maintain control over her, even in her absence. With these discoveries, the case took a decisive turn. John Mitchell was arrested on charges of kidnapping and suspected homicide. As the investigation progressed, A darker narrative began to take shape, one of psychological manipulation, control, and fear. Sarah had tried to escape her marriage she had been preparing, quietly and carefully, but John, it seemed, had found out the town of Hillcrest was shaken to its core for years. The Mitchells had appeared to be the ideal couple: Sarah, the warm and caring teacher; John, the respected local businessman. But beneath the surface was a relationship unraveling. Friends, family, and colleagues began to come forward. Sarah's best friend Melissa spoke about the toll John's control had taken. He would question Sarah about her whereabouts, criticize her choices, and make her feel isolated, though he was never physically violent. His emotional grip was suffocating. Sarah's sister, Emily, revealed that Sarah had opened a secret bank account in preparation to leave. She had been quietly withdrawing money, and had even secured a rental apartment in a nearby town, but something had stopped her. Emily recalled a chilling conversation. "I don't know if he'll let me go," Sarah had whispered once, her voice shaking. "I think he might hurt me." The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Among John's possessions was a series of meticulously written journals. At first glance, they seemed harmless accounts of anniversaries, holidays, and everyday life, but beneath the surface, the journals revealed an obsessive, almost delusional need to control and possess Sarah. He wrote constantly about his fear of losing her. He tracked her routines, he documented arguments, noting her tone, her expressions, her words. It was as if he was trying to rewrite their shared history, turning her resistance into betrayal, her independence into a threat for the detectives. The evidence was overwhelming. John hadn't simply lost control in a moment of rage. He had been spiraling toward this outcome for months, maybe years. Sarah had become a prisoner in her own life, and when she tried to break free, he made sure she couldn't. What began as a missing person case had now become a murder investigation, and while Sarah's body had yet to be found, the mounting evidence against John Mitchell told its own story, a tragic, terrifying portrait of control, desperation, and silence. Sarah Mitchell had tried to escape. She had almost made it, but in the end, her husband's obsession proved stronger than her fear. Rand Hillcrest would never be the same. The obsession of John Mitchell, a descent into control. John Mitchell's private journals offered a disturbing look into his psyche. They were filled with confessions of jealousy, possessiveness, and his twisted belief that Sarah could never be truly happy without him. Over and over, he wrote of his need to control her, insisting that he was the only person who truly understood her. To John, their relationship wasn't a partnership, it was possession. As investigators dug deeper, John's obsessive behavior became increasingly evident, hidden within the walls of the Mitchell home. Police discovered a network of covert surveillance cameras, devices John had installed without Sarah's knowledge. They were placed in nearly every room, the living room, the kitchen, and even the bedroom. This wasn't about security, it was about domination. John had been watching Sarah's every move, monitoring her in secret. His need to control extended far beyond jealousy, had become a dangerous compulsion. As police followed the trail of evidence, they began to suspect that Sarah's disappearance had not been an impulsive act. Instead, it looked like the result of methodical, calculated planning. Forensic analysis revealed that Sarah's phone had been turned off the night she vanished. It had not been used since investigators traced the phone's final location to a remote, wooded area just outside Hillcrest, a secluded stretch of land known for its thick brush and difficult terrain. The last ping from Sarah's phone had come from just a few miles from the Mitchell home. Then silence. Sarah had simply vanished. John claimed he had been home all night on September 7th, the night Sarah disappeared, but there were no witnesses to confirm his story. No neighbors saw him. No security footage placed him at home. It was his word, and only his, despite the absence of physical evidence directly tying John to Sarah's disappearance. The circumstantial evidence was damning. His obsessive control, the hidden cameras, and his disturbing emotional detachment all pointed to a chilling conclusion. John Mitchell had orchestrated his wife's disappearance, But investigators knew they needed more. They couldn't make an arrest without definitive proof, so the search expanded. Forensic teams combed the wooded area near the Mitchell home, hoping to find anything: clothing remains, a personal item that might bring them closer to the truth. Meanwhile, John remained under constant scrutiny. His lawyer maintained his innocence, arguing that there was no hard evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance. John continued to deny everything. He claimed he was just as shocked as everyone else, insisting that Sarah must have left on her own, but the police weren't convinced. Neither was the town. The community of Hillcrest was stunned for years. John and Sarah Mitchell had appeared to be the perfect couple, but now that illusion was shattered with every new revelation. It became harder to believe John's version of events. Then the breakthrough came. A team of forensic specialists conducted a deep analysis of the surveillance system John had installed, while Sarah had been aware of visible outdoor cameras. She had no idea about the hidden ones inside the house. These covert devices had been recording for weeks, possibly longer though. Footage was haunting. It captured hours of Sarah's private life, preparing meals, reading quietly, talking on the phone, and throughout it, John watching her, sometimes from the hallway, sometimes hovering just out of frame. His presence was always there, silent, ominous. In one especially disturbing clip, John interrogates Sarah about a phone call from a male coworker. His tone is calm, but his words are sharp. Controlling Sarah's posture is tense, her shoulders drawn inward, her eyes downcast. She had learned to walk on eggshells to anticipate his moods before they escalated. But the most damning footage of all was recorded on the night of September 7th, the night Sarah disappeared, at approximately 3 a.m. A hidden bedroom camera recorded John quietly entering the room. Sarah was asleep. He stood in the doorway for several moments, watching her. Then he crept forward, walking to her dresser. The camera's angle was imperfect, but investigators could clearly make out a subtle movement. John opened a drawer and retrieved something. It was her engagement ring. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion or panic. John had removed Sarah's ring while she slept, and she was never seen again. It was the final confirmation that investigators needed. The footage aligned perfectly with the timeline. John had acted with chilling precision. Sarah's disappearance had been carefully planned and coldly executed. Detectives now had the proof they had waited for. John Mitchell was arrested and formally charged with the kidnapping and suspected murder of his wife, Sarah Mitchell. The story dominated headlines. Hillcrest was reeling. The community that once celebrated the Mitchells as a model couple was now grappling with the horror of what had truly happened behind closed doors. Sarah had tried to leave. She had made a plan. She had opened a secret bank account. She had told her friend she was afraid, but in the end, John made sure she would never get away. Story 7. The murder of Sarah Mitchell. The discovery of Sarah Mitchell's body changed everything. Following a judge's approval of a search warrant, forensic teams returned to the Mitchells' property, time focusing on a densely wooded area that had previously been overlooked. After days of painstaking, methodical searching, their efforts were finally rewarded. Beneath a thick canopy of trees and layers of brush, they uncovered a shallow grave. Inside were the remains of Sarah Mitchell. She had been buried with deliberate care, as though someone had wanted to ensure she would never be found. An autopsy confirmed what many had feared. Sarah had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The medical examiner determined her time of death was the night of September 7, just hours after the last recording from the hidden bedroom camera. The news sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Hillcrest. Sarah and John Mitchell had been seen as a model couple, respected and admired, but now the evidence revealed a very different story. Police had already gathered damning circumstantial evidence: John's obsessive need to control Sarah, the secret cameras he'd installed throughout their home, and the footage capturing disturbing glimpses of their toxic relationship. The final blow came when one video showed John removing Sarah's engagement ring in the middle of the night, just before she vanished. With this grim discovery, the puzzle came together. Investigators believed John Mitchell had meticulously planned his wife's murder. watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The trial that followed captivated the entire nation. John Mitchell was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of a body. The prosecution presented a powerful case built on forensic findings, the chilling surveillance footage, and emotional testimony from Sarah's friends and family. Witnesses described a woman who had once been full of life, gradually reduced to someone who lived in fear, trapped in a marriage where control and manipulation masked themselves as devotion. John's defense painted him as a devastated husband, blindsided by his wife's sudden disappearance. They insisted there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder, but the jury didn't agree. After less than a day of deliberation, they found John Mitchell guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for the town of Hillcrest. The trial was a sobering reminder of the horrors that can unfold behind closed doors and the devastating consequences of unchecked control and emotional abuse for Sarah's family. It was a heartbreaking end to a story that had begun with love, but ended in tragedies. The years that followed, Sarah's case became a symbol. Her name invoked in discussions around domestic violence, surveillance abuse, and emotional manipulation. Her death spurred change, awareness. In conversation, her memory lives on, not as a victim, but as a voice that could no longer be silenced. Story 8. The exoneration of Juan Melendez. In September 2000, the American justice system was shaken by a case that would go on to challenge the very foundations of capital punishment. Juan Melendez had spent over 17 years on Florida's death row for a murder he did not commit in 1984. Melendez was arrested and later convicted for the killing of Delbert Baker. The case against him was paper-thin, built solely on the testimony of two witnesses, both of whom would later recant. No physical evidence connected Melendez to the crime. Still, the jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to death for nearly 2 decades. Melendez maintained his innocence, but the system that condemned him seemed deaf to his pleas. His appeals were repeatedly denied. The truth, however, would eventually surface in a stunning breakthrough. A transcript was discovered containing a recorded confession from the actual killer. That confession had been heard by at least 16 people, all of whom either directly or indirectly knew that Melendez had nothing to do with the crime. Yet the state had pursued a conviction with chilling determination. In light of this new evidence, Melendez's case was reviewed in January 2002. He was finally released from prison, a free man, after 6,640 days behind bars for a crime he did not commit. The fallout was immediate and profound. Melendez's exoneration reignited a national conversation about the death penalty, wrongful convictions, and the fallibility of the justice system. His story laid bare the cracks in a system that allowed a man to be sentenced to death, despite a complete lack of forensic evidence. It was a wake-up call. His case triggered debates among lawmakers, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates about the reliability of eyewitness testimony, the ethical responsibility of prosecutors, and the urgent need for reform. It also highlighted the critical role of post-conviction DNA testing, which, in many cases, has become a lifeline for the innocent. For Melendez, the toll had been immense. He had spent his prime years in a 6x9 cell, enduring not only the brutal physical conditions of death row, but also the psychological torment of knowing he was innocent, and that no one believed him. Yet he never gave up. His unwavering fight for justice became a symbol of hope for others. Wrongfully convicted, his story gave a voice to the voiceless and exposed how easily justice can be twisted by negligence, indifference, or ambition. Melendez's exoneration wasn't just his victory, it was a moment of reckoning for a nation that had nearly executed an innocent man. It proved that the system can fail and that the cost of that failure is a human life. His case remains a poignant reminder of why reform matters, and why the pursuit of justice must always be tempered by humility, compassion, and an uncompromising commitment to truth. It took nearly 2 decades. But the truth finally broke through, not because of a dramatic courtroom confession or a last-minute witness, but because of a forgotten piece of evidence buried in a stack of old paperwork in September 2000. A nearly accidental discovery changed the course of Juan Melendez's life forever. A transcript of a taped confession, made by the real killer, surfaced. This wasn't the result of pressure from investigators or any kind of legal bargain. It was an unsolicited, raw admission made to multiple people. The killer had openly bragged about the crime, even revealing chilling details that only someone familiar with the scene could have known. For Juan Melendez, a man who had spent over 17 years on Florida's death row, it was the break he had been waiting for, proof that he had not committed the murder of Delbert Baker in 1983, the crime for which he was sentenced to die. Following this revelation, legal proceedings moved swiftly. Prosecutors who had once stood firm on Melendez's conviction were now forced to reconsider the case in a new light. It became increasingly clear that the original conviction had been built on flimsy, circumstantial evidence. There had been no physical proof tying Melendez to the crime, and the two witnesses who had testified against him had long since recanted. Still, the damage had already been done. Years of isolation, fear, and psychological trauma had taken their toll. Though he had been granted a retrial, true justice only came after the taped confession became public. That's when the case collapsed entirely. Melendez's conviction was overturned, and he walked out of prison in 2002, after 17 long years under the shadow of execution for a crime he did not commit. But freedom came at a heavy cost. The emotional toll was staggering. Juan had spent the prime of his life behind bars, confined to a small cell, living each day with the fear that it might be his last outside. The world had moved on, technology had changed, people had grown older, and the life he had once known had disappeared. He was a man displaced in time, trying to reconnect with a world that had forgotten him. And yet, in the face of unimaginable hardship, Juan Melendez did not fade into the background. He chose to speak out, not with anger, but with purpose. His first public statements weren't filled with celebration. They were focused on the system that had failed him, and the countless others like him. He became a tireless advocate for the wrongfully convicted, using his story as a rallying cry for reform in the American criminal justice system. Melendez began traveling across the country, speaking at universities, legal conferences, and rallies. He shared the raw, painful truth of what it meant to be an innocent man on death row. His message was clear: the justice system is fallible, and without safeguards, innocent lives can and do get lost. He spoke about others he had met while incarcerated, men who, like him, maintained their innocence. Some fought on, others gave up, crushed by the weight of hopelessness. But Melendez never stopped believing that the truth would prevail. His faith had been shaken, but never extinguished. His advocacy went beyond the death penalty. It reached into the very mechanics of how justice is administered. He demanded reforms, better handling of evidence, improved witness identification procedures, and stronger legal representation for defendants who couldn't afford quality defense. He warned of the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence and coerced confessions, all the factors that had led to his own wrongful conviction. Juan Melendez became more than just a survivor of a miscarriage of justice. He became a symbol of resilience, determination, and hope, a living reminder of why reform is not just necessary, but urgent. His story revealed cracks in the foundation of the justice system, and though his freedom marked a personal triumph, it also served as a damning indictment of a process that had nearly cost an innocent man his life. As Juan Melendez stepped out of the Florida State Prison, he stepped into a life forever altered, free, but not whole. The scars of his ordeal would never fully fade, but he carried them with purpose, turning his pain into power and his voice into a force for change. His case remains one of the most powerful examples of the need for justice reform, a cautionary tale that reminds us all, as long as innocent people can be sentenced to die, no system is truly just. Juan Melendez, the cost of wrongful conviction. It took a nearly forgotten piece of evidence buried for years in a stack of unreviewed paperwork to finally make the justice system listen. In September 2000, a recorded confession by the real killer emerged, and with it, a chilling realization. An innocent man had spent nearly 2 decades on death row. The confession wasn't coerced, there was no plea deal, no incentive. It was a raw, unsolicited admission of guilt. The man responsible had even shared the gruesome details with others, people familiar with the crime scene, long before the tape ever surfaced. This revelation, so simple, yet damning, became the turning point. In the case of Juan Melendez, what followed was a rapid unraveling of the prosecution's case. The conviction against Melendez, once seen as ironclad, began to crumble under scrutiny. Prosecutors who had once championed his death sentence were now forced to reconsider. There had never been any physical evidence linking Melendez to the murder. The witnesses who testified against him had since recanted. Still, the damage was already done, though granted a retrial. It wasn't until the taped confession came to light that the charges were finally dropped. Melendez reflected on the trauma of those years spent in a tiny cell, waiting to die for a crime he didn't commit. His story was no longer just his own. It represented countless others who were still imprisoned for crimes they never committed. When Juan Melendez walked out of Florida State Prison after 17 years on death row, the world he stepped into was unrecognizable. Technology had changed, friends had disappeared, some family members had aged beyond recognition. He was a free man, but emotionally, spiritually he was scarred. Re-entering society wasn't just a process, it was a war against time, lost in a world that had left him behind. And yet, amid the confusion, one thing was clear: Juan Melendez had a mission. He began speaking publicly, not out of bitterness, but out of purpose. His voice, once silenced by bars and courtrooms, became a powerful call for reform. He wasn't just a symbol of a miscarriage of justice. He was a living reminder that the system did fail, and in death penalty cases, those failures could be fatal. Throughout his years behind bars, Melendez met others like him who claimed their innocence, some still fighting, others who had given up long ago. He never lost faith that the truth would surface, and when it finally did, he made a promise to use his story to prevent others from enduring what he had. His advocacy extended far beyond the death penalty. Melendez pushed for systemic change, better legal representation for the poor, improved procedures for evidence handling, reforms in witness identification, and accountability for prosecutors who overlooked red flags. He exposed the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence or coerced confessions. He argued that truth often hides beneath layers of error, bias, and haste, and it was the responsibility of society to uncover it before it was too late. The Melendez case became a landmark cautionary tale, studied in law schools and dissected by justice reform groups across the nation. It underscored the critical need for forensic rigor, transparency, and safeguards against wrongful convictions. Although DNA testing wasn't what freed him, the case highlighted how scientific advances could help protect the innocent in future prosecutions. But beyond the legal implications, Juan Melendez's story shed light on the human cost of wrongful imprisonment, the trauma, the alienation, the lifelong psychological toll of knowing your life could end for something you didn't do. Freedom, for Melendez, was not just about walking out of prison. It was about reclaiming a voice and using it to fight for those still unheard. He became a tireless advocate, traveling the country, speaking at universities, court reform panels, and justice summits. With every speech, every interview, he reminded the public of one undeniable truth: the system is fallible, and when it fails, real lives are destroyed. Melendez's exoneration wasn't the end of the story, was the beginning of a movement. And for him, the fight for justice had only just begun. The confession that ultimately exonerated Juan Melendez was more than just a statement. It was an irrefutable piece of evidence that dismantled the entire case against him for years. That taped admission by the true killer had been ignored, collecting dust while Melendez sat on death row. There had been no solid forensic evidence tying him to the crime, and glaring inconsistencies in witness testimonies had gone uninvestigated. It was a devastating illustration of systemic failure. Melendez's wrongful conviction became a powerful example of why forensic protocols must be held to the highest standards as DNA testing and forensic science continued to evolve. His case underscored the importance of rigorous evidence handling to prevent future injustices. But while science may be able to correct past mistakes, it cannot undo the psychological damage inflicted on a man who spent nearly 2 decades in solitary confinement, waiting to die for a crime he did not commit. Though Melendez was released from prison, he remained imprisoned by trauma, the constant fear of execution, the isolation, and the daily struggle to convince anyone guards lawyers. Even fellow inmates that he was innocent had left deep emotional scars. His freedom came with a heavy burden. Re-entering society after 17 years felt like waking up in a foreign world. Technology had changed, culture had moved on. Some friends had faded away, others had died. Even his family, who had never stopped believing in him, had aged. Rebuilding those relationships took time and emotional labor, adapting to the rapid pace of life beyond prison walls was overwhelming for someone who had been cut off from it for so long. Yet through all of this, Melendez emerged with quiet strength and clarity of purpose. The fire of injustice had scorched away bitterness and left behind a man determined to make change. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for every silenced, forgotten soul still trapped behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. His voice became a beacon in the movement for criminal justice reform. Over time, Melendez became a powerful advocate. He spoke at conferences, gave interviews, and lent his story to the national conversation on justice. His experience, harrowing as it was, had not destroyed him, it had forged him into a symbol of resilience and purpose. For Juan Melendez, the fight for justice didn't end with his release. It had only just begun half a world away. The Surianelli case continued to send shockwaves throughout India long after the verdicts were delivered. As legal proceedings dragged on, the disturbing details that emerged shed light on long-standing flaws in the Indian justice system, particularly its handling of sexual violence cases. From the beginning, the case was marred by negligence and apparent apathy. The victim, a teenage girl, endured unimaginable abuse at the hands of multiple perpetrators, yet the police response was sluggish, even willfully negligent. Many suspected deliberate mishandling, likely due to the influence of powerful individuals implicated in the crime. It wasn't until the girl managed to escape and tell her story that the extent of the abuse was revealed. But by then, crucial evidence had been compromised, and some of the perpetrators had already vanished. Failure of law enforcement to act swiftly and decisively highlighted a disturbing reality. Victims of sexual violence in India often face systemic indifference. Instead of receiving support, the young girl's character was scrutinized, her intentions questioned, and her trauma dismissed. Public discourse was rife with victim blaming, fueled by deep-rooted patriarchal beliefs that painted survivors as responsible for their own suffering. Despite overwhelming odds, the victim's courage in pursuing justice was remarkable, but even her bravery couldn't speed up the wheels of justice. The legal process was riddled with delays. Accused individuals leveraged their status and connections to manipulate the trial's direction. It became painfully clear how difficult it was for an ordinary citizen, especially a young woman from a marginalized background, to demand justice in such an imbalanced system. Public frustration mounted, especially as one of the key accused, Dharmarajan, evaded arrest for years. His eventual capture only fueled more questions. Why did it take so long? Was it incompetence, or was it corruption? The Surianelli case did more than expose cracks in the criminal justice system. It revealed how deeply embedded misogyny was in Indian society. Women, especially those from disadvantaged communities, were often viewed as expendable. Their voices were silenced, their pain minimized, and their rights overlooked. Still, from this darkness emerged a collective cry for change. Activists and citizens alike demanded reform. The case became a catalyst for discussions around legislative overhaul, better protections for victims, and greater accountability for those who abuse power. Both Juan Melendez and the Surianelli victim endured horrors no one should have to face, but their stories became more than just accounts of suffering. They became calls to action, reminders that justice must not only be served, but safeguarded. These cases challenged broken systems and forced society to confront its own failings. In the shadows of injustice, they lit the way forward. The Surianelli case marked a turning point in India's reckoning with sexual violence. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a nationwide mirror held up to the justice system, reflecting its many failures and the painful realities victims face. As the case unfolded, it became clear that true justice required more than just punishing the guilty. It demanded listening to survivors, respecting their voices, and supporting them at every step of the journey. For the young victim, navigating the justice system was only part of the ordeal. She also had to endure the emotional and psychological aftermath of the crime, trauma, compounded by widespread social stigma and a disturbing lack of support in a society where survivors of sexual violence are often blamed rather than believed. She wasn't just fighting for justice in court. She was fighting for her dignity, her voice, and her right to heal and reclaim her life. One of the most significant outcomes of the Surianelli case was its profound influence on India's legal landscape. Activists and lawmakers repeatedly pointed to the gross mishandling of the investigation as a symbol of systemic dysfunction. It exposed the urgent need for stronger laws, improved police training, and faster, more victim-sensitive trial procedures. But beyond legal reform, the case underscored a deeper truth. Laws alone are not enough. Cultural transformation is equally essential. Without a shift in the societal attitudes that normalize, excuse, or trivialize sexual violence, legal advances risk being hollow. Over time, the Surianelli case became a landmark in India's growing conversation around women's rights and gender-based violence. The survivors' bravery in coming forward, despite immense societal and institutional pressure, paved the way for other victims to speak out. Her struggle added momentum to a broader movement, pushing for justice, equality, and visibility for survivors across the country. Yet, even as the legal system took small steps toward improvement, the case remained a sobering reminder of how difficult the road to justice really is. The emotional wounds left by such crimes don't fade quickly, and for many victims, the fight continues long after the courtroom battles end. The Surianelli case became a crucial study in understanding the complex, often discouraging realities of pursuing justice. In India, as the case evolved, its effects reverberated across legal, political, and social spheres. Public frustration over the delayed proceedings and inconsistent verdicts grew louder, while some perpetrators were eventually incarcerated. Questions lingered about the adequacy of those punishments, the institutional roadblocks victims face, and the societal conditions that enable such crimes in the first place. One of the most glaring failures highlighted by the case was the delay in arresting the primary accused, Dharmarajan, who remained at large for years. His eventual capture in 2000 was a relief, but it also underscored how broken the system had become, especially when power and influence interfered with the pursuit of justice. Public outcry reached a fever pitch, compelling lawmakers to confront the legal system's shortcomings. The Surianelli case, along with other high-profile incidents, became a driving force behind the push for legislative reform. In 2013, India passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, commonly known as the Nirbhaya Act, a direct response to national outrage following the 2012 Delhi gang rape and the echoes of earlier failures like Surianelli. This legislation expanded the legal definition of rape, introduced stricter punishments for sexual crimes, and emphasized the need for faster trial procedures. However, as the Surianelli case made painfully clear, legislative change without cultural reform is not enough. Entrenched gender biases and widespread victim blaming continued to taint both public opinion and judicial processes. Survivors, like the Surianelli victim, were too often met with suspicion instead of support, interrogated more about their behavior than that of their attackers. The media, the courts, and society at large frequently treated survivors as if they were on trial. This systemic tendency to scrutinize victims, rather than the accused, fed into a cycle of silence and shame, one that survivors struggled to break instead of investigating the crime and holding perpetrators accountable. Too much energy was spent questioning the survivor's morality, background, and intent. The societal prejudice surrounding survivors of sexual assault remained a significant barrier to justice and healing. The Surianelli case also exposed serious flaws in how sensitive cases were handled, from the collection of evidence to the protection of victims during trials. Justice delayed often meant justice denied. Many survivors abandoned their legal fights out of exhaustion or despair. The process was grueling, and the burden of proof disproportionately heavy. It became increasingly evident that punishing offenders was only part of the solution. Justice required a system that empowered and protected survivors, one where their voices were heard, their experiences validated, and their well-being prioritized at every stage. The justice system needed to provide not just punishment for crimes, but a path to healing and restoration for those affected by them. Another critical lesson from Surianelli was the need for widespread education and consent on gender equality and on the societal roots of sexual violence. While reforms introduced in the wake of the case made important strides, India's education system continued to struggle with embedding these essential values. True change would only come when families, schools, workplaces, and communities committed to challenging the patriarchal norms that enable abuse and silence survivors. Only when legal reform and cultural awakening happen in tandem can a society truly address the plague of sexual violence. The fight is as much about transforming minds and attitudes as it is about rewriting laws. Despite everything she endured, the Surianelli victim remained a powerful symbol of courage and resilience. Her identity was largely protected throughout the legal proceedings, but her voice echoed across a nation, reminding people that justice, though elusive, is worth pursuing. Her determination, even in the face of widespread societal rejection and institutional betrayal, inspired countless others who had been silenced. She became part of a larger wave of survivors who forced India to confront the uncomfortable truths about how it treats women and what must change. Her story remains a beacon, a painful one, but a necessary one. Sexual violence leaves scars that go far beyond the act itself for survivors. The journey toward healing is long, painful, and often lonely. The Surianelli case in India became a defining moment in the national conversation around sexual violence. Though the legal battle stretched over years, it ultimately became a story of resilience, not just of one girl, but of a society slowly awakening to the urgent need for justice. What began as a horrific case of gang rape quickly turned into a larger indictment of a justice system riddled with failure, delayed investigations, reluctant prosecutions, a community all too willing to blame the victim. But through it all, the survivor persevered, and so did those who stood with her. Activists, lawmakers, citizens who refused to let her story be forgotten. The Surianelli case forced India to confront the realities of sexual violence and the dangerous apathy within the system. It sparked public outcry, fueled reform movements, and led to legislative changes that would forever alter the way such crimes were prosecuted. Most importantly, it challenged societal norms that for too long had silenced victims and protected predators. But, as the world learned through justice is not just about punishing offenders. It's about creating a system where survivors are heard, protected, and empowered, where trauma is met with compassion, not suspicion, and where the long path to recovery is made a little less lonely through strong advocacy and meaningful support systems. Transition across the world. A legal earthquake in the United States. Narrator, while India was grappling with its own reckoning across the globe, the United States was facing a critical test of its own justice system. In October 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court took on a landmark case, Apprendi v. New Jersey, one that would forever shift the balance between judges, juries, and constitutional protections. At the heart of the case was a troubling question. Could a judge increase a criminal sentence based on facts they determined on their own, without a jury? The case centered around Charles Apprendi, a New Jersey man who had fired several shots into the home of an African-American family. Prosecutors pursued a penalty enhancement under a hate crime statute, which allowed the judge to impose a harsher sentence if he determined the act was racially motivated, and he did without the jury ever making that finding. Apprendi challenged this decision, arguing it violated his Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial and the due process guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. He claimed that any fact that increases a sentence beyond the statutory maximum should be proven to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, not decided by a judge based on a lower standard. And the Supreme Court agreed in a narrow 5-4 ruling. The court held that any fact that increases the penalty for a crime beyond the statutory maximum must be submitted to a jury and proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision became known as the Apprendi Rule, a fundamental shift in how sentencing would be handled in the U.S. The implications were massive. For decades, judges had broad discretion in enhancing sentences. They could weigh aggravating factors, like prior offenses or motives, based on their own findings, but Apprendi upended that tradition, reinforcing the jury's role as the ultimate fact-finder's. Ruling sent shockwaves through the legal community. Courts and legislatures were forced to re-examine sentencing procedures across the country. Many enhancements that had previously gone unchallenged were now unconstitutional, unless decided by a jury. Critics feared chaos. Would this slow down the system? Would it overwhelm juries with complex sentencing issues? Some warned that the ruling could paralyze already overloaded courts, but supporters saw something different. Justice. The decision was not about efficiency. They argued it was about fairness. It was about reinforcing the basic rights of defendants and ensuring that no one could be sentenced more harshly without the full weight of constitutional protections. Segment title: The Bigger Picture, the Global Struggle for Justice. Narrator: From the fields of Surianelli to the courtrooms of Washington, D.C. These cases, while separated by distance and culture, share a common thread: the pursuit of justice in flawed systems. In Surianelli, it was the survivor's voice that ultimately refused to be silenced, even as the world around her tried to look away. In Apprendi, it was a defendant's constitutional challenge that forced the nation to re-examine its sentencing laws. Both cases became catalysts for reform. Both exposed the fragility of legal systems when left unchecked, and both showed that, no matter how slow or controversial as possible, when courage meets principle, the fight for justice is never easy. It requires not just laws, but people willing to uphold them. It demands compassion for victims and vigilance for the rights of the accused, and it needs systems that are built not just to punish, but to protect, to heal, to restore. The road is long, but as the stories of Surianelli and Apprendi show us, every step matters. However, many viewed the Apprendi v. New Jersey decision as a necessary step toward ensuring fairness and transparency in the criminal justice system. Advocates argued that the ruling reaffirmed a foundational principle of American law, that every person is entitled to a trial by jury, and it is the jury, not the judge, that should determine the facts that could result in an enhanced sentence. The decision was widely hailed as a victory for the rights of the accused and a safeguard against potential judicial overreach by requiring that any sentencing enhancement be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Apprendi reinforced the prosecution's burden of proof and protected defendants from harsher penalties based on a judge's subjective interpretation of facts. Seen the immediate aftermath, the ruling triggered significant changes in how courts across the United States approached sentencing. States and the federal government were compelled to revise their sentencing frameworks to comply with the new constitutional standard. Laws that had previously allowed judges to enhance sentences based on factors like prior convictions, racial motivation, or gang affiliation were re-examined to ensure alignment with the Apprendi precedent. The impact was particularly profound at the federal level. Before Apprendi, federal sentencing guidelines gave judges broad discretion to increase sentences based on elements such as the presence of a firearm, the quantity of drugs involved in a case, or the offender's role within a criminal enterprise. Judges also considered factors like sophistication of the crime or victim vulnerability, often without jury input. Post-Apprendi, these factors could no longer be used to enhance a sentence, unless first presented to and proven before a jury. This shift required a major overhaul of the federal sentencing process. Prosecutors had to adjust their strategies, and judges had to navigate new limitations on their discretion. While some critics feared that this change would lead to more rigid sentencing and reduce the ability to tailor penalties to individual circumstances, others saw it as a long overdue correction to a system that had allowed unchecked judicial authority. Concerns arose that involving juries in every sentencing enhancement would slow down proceedings and burden an already strained judiciary. There were also fears that mandatory minimums and statutory thresholds might replace the nuance and flexibility that judges previously exercised. However, despite these concerns, many legal scholars and civil rights advocates defended the ruling as an essential check on judicial power. Supporters pointed out that judicial discretion, while valuable, carried the risk of implicit bias and unequal treatment, especially in cases involving race, gender, or socioeconomic status. By mandating that juries determine facts affecting sentencing, the court sought to ensure a more level playing field and to protect the rights of defendants from potential prejudice. The decision also resonated beyond the legal community, influencing public perceptions of justice and fairness. For reform advocates, Apprendi became part of a broader movement toward more equitable sentencing and greater accountability in the criminal justice system. It helped fuel conversations around mass incarceration, judicial transparency, and the need to prevent wrongful convictions and overly harsh penalties. At the same time, critics warned that the decision could hamper the justice system's ability to impose appropriate sentences in serious cases. They argued that experienced judges, familiar with the subtleties of law and sentencing, were better positioned to weigh aggravating factors than lay juries, particularly in cases involving extreme violence or vulnerable victims. There was concern that delays in sentencing could hinder justice. Nevertheless, the Apprendi ruling marked a decisive turning point. It compelled lawmakers, judges, and legal professionals to re-examine the intersection of constitutional rights, judicial authority, and fair sentencing practices. It emphasized the importance of upholding due process, even when the evidence against a defendant appears overwhelming or the crime is especially egregious. In the years that followed, Apprendi influenced several other landmark Supreme Court decisions, including Blakely v. Washington 2004 and United States v. Booker 2005. These cases further defined the constitutional limits of sentencing enhancements, solidifying the precedent that jury determinations, not judicial assumptions, must guide decisions that could deprive individuals of their liberty. The Supreme Court's decision in Apprendi v. New Jersey marked a turning point in the U.S. criminal justice system. At its core, the ruling reaffirmed a foundational principle that every person accused of a crime has the constitutional right to a trial by jury, and that it is the jury, not the judge, who must decide any fact that could increase a defendant's sentence. Beyond the statutory maximum, supporters of the decision hailed it as a victory for due process, fairness, and transparency. By requiring that sentencing enhancements be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, Apprendi reinforced the burden of proof as a cornerstone of justice. It aimed to curb judicial overreach and ensure that no defendant faced a harsher punishment based solely on a judge's subjective interpretation of facts. The aftermath of Apprendi was felt almost immediately. Courts across the country, both state and federal, were compelled to revisit and revise their sentencing structures. Laws that previously allowed judges to impose longer sentences based on factors like prior criminal history, gang affiliation, or the use of a weapon, without jury involvement, came under intense scrutiny in the federal system. This posed a significant challenge at the time. Federal sentencing guidelines gave judges wide discretion to increase penalties based on a variety of unproven or unadmitted factors, such as the amount of drugs in a case, a defendant's leadership role in a criminal enterprise, or whether the crime was committed with unusual sophistication but under apprendi. These factors could no longer be considered unless first proven to a jury or admitted by the defendant. This fundamental shift limited judicial discretion and sparked debate across the legal community. While many welcomed the move as a safeguard against bias and unchecked power, critics feared it might make sentencing more rigid and less individualized. There was growing concern that mandatory jury findings could delay proceedings or lead to inconsistent outcomes across similar cases. Nonetheless, legal scholars and reform advocates stood firm in their support. They argued that requiring jury involvement reduced the risk of discriminatory sentencing and protected defendants from hidden or arbitrary enhancements. Apprendi, they said, was a necessary step to ensure the integrity and fairness of the justice system. Its ripple effects were wide-reaching. The decision quickly became part of a larger conversation around mass incarceration and sentencing reform. It shed light on long-standing disparities, especially in drug-related cases and offenses disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. Soon, Apprendi laid the groundwork for other landmark rulings in Blakely v. Washington 2004. The court expanded on Apprendi, requiring that any fact increasing a sentence must be either admitted by the defendant or proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, in United States v. Booker 2005, the court ruled that the federal sentencing guidelines, once mandatory,